You want to know what real power looks like? It isn't the crown. It isn't the title. It isn't even the fortune stacked so high it could rebuild half of London twice over. Real power is standing in a room full of men who want you dead and making them remember why they fear you more than they hate you. That's what Adrian Blackwell learned the night before his wedding, the night the entire House of Lords tried to vote him into irrelevance while his bride-to-be slept in ignorance 20 miles away. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Stay with me. This story doesn't end where you think it does. The rain came down like punishment the morning Adrian Blackwell married a woman he'd never loved. He stood at the cathedral entrance while London turned gray and cold around him, his black coat pulled tight against the October wind, watching carriages arrive one by one. The nobility spilled out in their finest silks and cruelest smiles. They came to witness his humiliation dressed as a wedding. Everyone knew it. Adrian knew it. And somewhere inside that cathedral, Lady Vivian Ashbourne probably knew it too. The marriage was survival, nothing more. Adrian's man, Thomas Grid, appeared at his elbow, water dripping from his hat brim. He'd been Adrian's steward for 12 years and had the kind of face that looked permanently disappointed with the world. Thomas didn't bother with pleasantries. Never did. "The Ashbournes arrived 10 minutes ago," he said quietly. "The girl looks terrified. She should be. Your guests are asking why you're still standing out here in the rain instead of inside." Adrian watched another carriage pull up. Lord Pemberton stepped out, fat and smug, the kind of man who smiled widest when he smelled blood in the water. He'd been one of the loudest voices in Parliament last night, demanding Adrian's removal from the Duchy Council, calling the Blackwell name diseased, accusing Adrian of using his dead brother's scandal to consolidate power. The accusation was partially true, which made it worse. "Let them ask," Adrian said. Thomas glanced sideways at him. "You can't keep everyone waiting forever." "I'm not keeping them waiting. I'm reminding them who they're dealing with." "By standing in the rain?" "By making them sit in silence while they wonder if I'll even show up to my own wedding." Thomas exhaled slowly, the sound of a man who'd given this exact lecture before and knew it wouldn't land. "You're playing a dangerous game." Adrian finally turned to look at him. His face was all sharp lines and controlled fury, the kind of expression that made grown men reconsider their words before speaking. "I've been playing a dangerous game since I was 16 years old. The only difference now is that I'm better at it than they are." He walked inside. The cathedral was cold and enormous and filled with people who despised him. Adrian moved down the center aisle without looking left or right. Whispers followed him like smoke. He caught fragments as he passed, words like arrogant, ruthless, his brother's blood. They said Henry's death 2 years ago hadn't been an accident. They said Adrian had wanted the title so badly he'd let his older brother destroy himself with gambling and opium until there was nothing left to inherit but a name. They weren't entirely wrong about that either. He reached the altar and turned to face the crowd. His expression gave away nothing. It never did. That was the first lesson his father had beaten into him as a child. Never let them see you break. Never let them see you care. The moment you flinch, you lose. Adrian hadn't flinched in 20 years. The priest stood beside him, a skeletal old man who looked like he'd rather be presiding over a funeral. Appropriate, Adrian thought. This marriage was a funeral of sorts, a burial of whatever naive hope he'd once carried that his life might be his own. The organ began to play. Everyone stood, and Adrian saw his bride for the first time. Vivian Ashbourne walked down the aisle like a woman heading toward the gallows. She was beautiful in the way expensive things are beautiful, polished, perfect, and entirely artificial. Her dress was ivory silk that probably cost more than her father could afford, which explained why the man looked ready to vomit in the front pew. Her dark hair was pinned beneath a veil that hid most of her face, but Adrian could see her eyes. Wide, terrified, focused somewhere past his shoulder because she couldn't bring herself to look at him directly. Smart girl. She reached the altar and her father, Lord Edmund Ashbourne, a man whose gambling debts had brought them all to this point, placed her hand in Adrian's with the relieved desperation of someone unloading a burden he could no longer carry. Adrian felt the tremor in her fingers. The priest began the ceremony. Adrian didn't listen. He'd read the vows a dozen times already, knew every word, every legal trap embedded in the language. This wasn't a marriage. It was a contract. Vivian's family got financial rescue and social rehabilitation. Adrian got political legitimacy and a buffer against the lords who wanted to strip his duchy apart for pieces. Everyone won, except maybe the two people standing at the altar. The priest was saying something about love and honor and fidelity. Adrian felt Vivian's hand tighten in his, not in affection, but in sheer survival reflex. He looked down at her. She still wouldn't meet his eyes. "Do you, Adrian Victor Blackwell, take this woman?" "I do," Adrian said. His voice cut through the cathedral like a blade. The priest faltered, then turned to Vivian. "And do you, Vivian Elizabeth Ashbourne?" "I do." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Then by the power vested in me," Adrian didn't wait for the rest. He lifted Vivian's veil, leaned down, and kissed her once, briefly, with all the warmth of a business transaction. Her lips were cold. So were his. The crowd erupted in polite applause. And just like that, Adrian Blackwell had a wife. The reception was held at Ashbourne Hall, which was about as depressing as Adrian had expected. The estate had clearly seen better days. The wallpaper was faded, the furniture slightly worn, the crystal chandeliers missing a few pieces that had probably been sold off to pay debts. The Ashbournes were nobility in name only now. This wedding was their last gamble. Adrian stood near the window with a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched, watching the performance unfold. Vivian sat at the center table, surrounded by well-wishers who offered congratulations that sounded more like condolences. She smiled at each one, nodded at the right moments, played her part beautifully. Adrian almost admired it. She was good at pretending. So was he. "Quite the catch you've made, Blackwell." Adrian didn't turn. He recognized the voice. Lord Raymond Hargrave, one of Parliament's more venomous members, a man who'd spent the last 2 years trying to dismantle everything Adrian had built. Hargrave stepped beside him, raising his own glass in mock salute. "I hear the Ashbourne girl comes with more debts than dowry. How very generous of you." "Generosity has nothing to do with it." "No, I suppose not. You don't strike me as the generous type." Adrian finally looked at him. Hargrave was older, mid-50s, with the kind of smug entitlement that came from never having earned anything in his life. "Was there a point to this conversation, or are you just here to waste my time?" Hargrave smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "I'm here to remind you that a marriage won't save you. The council voted last night. You're on probation, Blackwell. One misstep, one hint of scandal, and we'll have your title stripped before you can blink." "Is that a threat?" "It's a promise." Adrian set his glass down carefully on the windowsill. When he turned to face Hargrave fully, the shift in his posture was subtle but unmistakable. The air between them went cold. "Let me make you a promise in return," Adrian said quietly. "The next time you try to vote me out of power, make sure you have the numbers to actually do it. Because if you fail again, I'll make it my personal mission to expose every shady land deal, every bribed official, and every mistress you've kept on the taxpayer's coin. And when I'm done, you won't have a career left to protect." Hargrave's smile faltered. Adrian leaned in just close enough to make the other man uncomfortable. "Do we understand each other?" For a moment, Hargrave said nothing. Then he stepped back, straightened his coat, and forced his smile back into place. "Enjoy your wedding night, Blackwell." He walked away. Adrian watched him go, his jaw tight, his hands clenched at his sides. This was his life now. Constant battles, constant threats. And now he'd dragged someone else into the middle of it. He looked across the room at Vivian. She was watching him. Their eyes met for the first time since the altar, and something passed between them. Not warmth, not understanding, but acknowledgement. They were both trapped, both playing roles they hadn't chosen, both too proud to admit how much it cost them. Then Vivian looked away. Adrian drained his whiskey in one swallow and left the reception without saying goodbye. Blackwell Manor sat on the edge of London like a fortress. It was massive, dark, and built from stone that looked like it had been carved from the earth itself. The estate sprawled across 15 acres of manicured gardens, hedge mazes, and ironwork gates that could stop an army. Adrian's ancestors had built it 300 years ago as a statement, "This family does not kneel." Adrian had inherited that philosophy along with the title. He arrived hours before Vivian, which was intentional. He needed time to think, time to prepare, time to remind himself why he'd agreed to this absurd arrangement in the first place. Thomas met him in the main hall. "The staff is ready," Thomas said. Your wife's belongings have been moved to the East Wing. The East Wing? Adrian frowned. That's half the manor away from my quarters. You said you wanted separate rooms. I said separate beds, not separate continents. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Would you like me to move her closer? Adrian considered it, then shook his head. Distance was better. Safer. The less time they spent in proximity, the less chance either of them would develop the dangerous illusion that this marriage meant something. Leave it, Adrian said. He climbed the stairs to his study, a room lined floor to ceiling with books he'd actually read and maps of territories he actually controlled. This was where he did his real work, not in Parliament, not at social functions. Here, alone, where no one could see him strategize. He poured himself another whiskey and sat behind his desk. An hour later, Vivian arrived. Adrian heard the commotion from downstairs, the servants greeting her, the murmur of voices, the sound of trunks being carried inside. He didn't go down to meet her. That wasn't part of the arrangement. They'd agreed, through their respective families, that this marriage would be a formality. Separate lives. Separate spaces. A unified front in public and complete indifference in private. It was the only way this could work. But around midnight, there was a knock on his study door. Adrian looked up from the contract he'd been reviewing. Come in. The door opened. Vivian stood in the hallway, still wearing her wedding dress, though she'd removed the veil. Her hair had come partially loose, falling in dark waves around her shoulders. She looked exhausted. I'm sorry to disturb you, she said quietly. I wasn't sure if we were supposed to speak tonight. Adrian set down his pen. We're not required to. I know, She hesitated, then stepped inside. I wanted to make sure we understood each other. Understood what? That I'm not here to interfere with your life. I know this marriage is political. I know you didn't want it. I didn't want it either. She took a breath. But my family was drowning, and you threw us a rope, so I'll play my part. I'll attend your events, smile at your enemies, and stay out of your way. That's all I'm asking. Just let me stay out of your way. Adrian studied her. There was something raw in her voice, something that cut through the polished performance she'd been giving all day. This wasn't the terrified girl at the altar. This was someone who'd already accepted defeat and was trying to negotiate terms. You think that's all I want from you? Adrian asked. Isn't it? He stood up, walked around the desk, and leaned against the front edge. Vivian didn't move, but he saw her posture stiffen. What I want, Adrian said slowly, is for this arrangement to work. That means you represent the Blackwell name in public. You attend functions, you make allies, you become someone they can't dismiss as a pawn, because if they think you're weak, they'll use you against me. Vivian's eyes narrowed. I'm not weak. Then prove it. The words hung in the air between them. For a moment, Adrian thought she might argue, but instead she nodded once, a sharp, defiant gesture. Fine, she said. I'll prove it. Then she turned and walked out. Adrian watched the door close behind her and realized, for the first time, that maybe he'd underestimated his new wife. The first week passed in cold silence. Vivian kept to the East Wing. Adrian stayed in his study. They crossed paths occasionally in the halls, exchanged brief nods, and continued on without speaking. The servants whispered, but Adrian didn't care. This was exactly what he'd wanted, a marriage in name only, with no complications. But on the 8th day, something changed. Adrian was in the library when he heard raised voices coming from the courtyard. He walked to the window and looked down. Vivian stood near the fountain, facing off against Margaret Holt, the head housekeeper. Margaret was a severe woman in her 60s who'd worked for the Blackwell family for 40 years and believed she ran the estate more effectively than Adrian did. She probably wasn't wrong, but right now she was berating Vivian in front of half the staff. Adrian couldn't hear the exact words, but the body language was clear. Margaret was furious. Vivian was holding her ground. Then Vivian said something that made Margaret's face go pale. The housekeeper stepped back, stared at Vivian for a long moment, then turned and stormed inside. Adrian felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest. Curiosity, maybe, or respect. He left the library and found Vivian still standing by the fountain, her arms crossed, her jaw set. What was that about? Adrian asked. Vivian glanced at him, startled. Nothing. A disagreement. Margaret Holt doesn't lose disagreements. She did today. Adrian stepped closer. What did you say to her? Vivian hesitated, then sighed. She was refusing to give the kitchen staff extra coal for the stoves. They've been working in freezing conditions for 3 days. I told her to requisition more from the storage, or I'd do it myself. And she said I didn't have the authority. Adrian raised an eyebrow. What did you tell her? I told her I'm the Duchess of Blackwell now, and if she questioned my authority again, I'd replace her by the end of the week. A slow smile crossed Adrian's face. You threatened Margaret Holt? I did. Most people are too terrified of her to even make eye contact. I'm not most people. Adrian looked at her, really looked at her, and saw something he hadn't noticed before. Vivian Ashbourne wasn't just playing a part. She was fighting for space in a world that had tried to crush her, just like he was. The coal will be delivered by this afternoon, Adrian said. Vivian blinked. You're approving it? You're my wife. If you give an order to the staff, it stands. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite gratitude, not quite trust, but recognition. Thank you, she said quietly. Adrian nodded once, then turned to leave. But before he reached the manor, Vivian called after him. Adrian? He stopped. It was the first time she'd used his name without a title attached. Yes? Why did you marry me? The question caught him off guard. He turned back slowly. You already know why. I know the political reasons, but there were other options, other families, other alliances. She took a step closer. So why me? Adrian considered lying. It would have been easier, but something about the way she asked, direct, unflinching, made him tell the truth. Because your father's debts made you desperate, Adrian said. And desperate people don't ask questions. They just survive. Vivian's face hardened. So you chose me because you thought I'd be easy to control. I chose you because I thought you'd understand what this marriage actually is. A transaction, nothing more. And do I? Adrian met her eyes. I don't know yet. He walked inside and left her standing alone in the courtyard. But later that night, when Adrian couldn't sleep and wandered down to the kitchens, he found the stoves burning warm and the staff smiling for the first time in weeks. And he realized that maybe, just maybe, Vivian Ashbourne was going to be more trouble than he'd bargained for. 3 weeks into the marriage, London society struck its first blow. The Blackwells were invited to a royal banquet at Kensington Palace, one of those glittering, venomous affairs where alliances were forged and reputations destroyed between courses. Adrian had attended dozens of them. He knew how the game worked. Vivian didn't. She dressed carefully that night, a deep emerald gown that matched her eyes, her hair swept up in an elegant twist. She looked every inch the Duchess. But when they arrived at the palace and stepped into the ballroom, Adrian saw her falter. The room went quiet. Not silent, just quiet enough for everyone to notice their entrance, quiet enough for the whispers to start. Adrian felt Vivian's hand tighten on his arm. Ignore them, he said quietly. They're staring. They always stare. It's what they do. But as they moved deeper into the room, Adrian realized the stares were different tonight, sharper, more predatory. Something was wrong. Lord Pemberton approached first, his face flushed with wine and malice. Blackwell and the new Duchess! How lovely to see you both! Pemberton, Adrian said coolly. I must say, I was surprised to see your name on the guest list. After last week's scandal, I thought you might prefer to lay low for a while. Adrian's jaw tightened. What scandal? Pemberton's smile widened. You mean you haven't heard? Oh dear, perhaps I shouldn't say anything. Say it. Pemberton glanced at Vivian, then back at Adrian. It's about your wife's family. Apparently Lord Ashbourne's debts were far more extensive than anyone realized. There's talk of fraud, embezzlement, some very serious accusations. Vivian went pale. Adrian's voice dropped to a lethal calm. Who's making these accusations? Half of Parliament, from what I hear. There's even a formal investigation being launched. Very unfortunate timing, really. Right after your wedding. Pemberton's smile turned cruel. One might almost think someone wanted to embarrass you. Adrian felt rage building in his chest, cold and controlled. This was a coordinated attack. Pemberton, Hargrave, and whoever else wanted to see him fall. They'd manufactured a scandal targeting Vivian's family to undermine his political standing. And they were doing it in public where he couldn't fight back without causing a scene. Pemberton leaned in closer. Of course, if you'd like to distance yourself from the Ashbourne name, I'm sure the council would understand. An annulment could be arranged quietly. No shame in cutting loose a liability. Adrian moved. It happened faster than Pemberton could react. Adrian grabbed the front of the man's coat, hauled him close, and spoke in a voice low enough that only Pemberton and Vivian could hear. If you ever speak about my wife like that again, I will destroy you. Not politically, not financially, personally. I will dig up every secret you've buried, every lie you've told, every crime you've committed, and I will make sure the entire world knows exactly what kind of man you are. And when you've lost everything, your title, your fortune, your reputation, I'll make sure you remember it was because you forgot who you were dealing with. Pemberton's face went white. Adrian released him and stepped back, straightening his own coat as if nothing had happened. The ballroom had gone completely silent now. Everyone was watching. Adrian turned to Vivian, offered his arm, and said calmly, "Shall we?" Vivian stared at him for a moment, something unreadable in her eyes. Then she took his arm, and together they walked across the ballroom floor while 300 people watched in stunned silence. They didn't speak until they were outside, standing on the palace steps under the cold October sky. Vivian pulled her hand away from his arm. Her face was flushed, her breathing uneven. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Yes, I did. They'll use it against you. They'll say you're unstable, violent. Let them." Vivian looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time Adrian saw something other than fear in her eyes. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why defend me like that? You said this marriage was just a transaction. You said it didn't mean anything." Adrian didn't have a good answer. He didn't know when the calculation had shifted, didn't know when Vivian had stopped being a political tool and started being someone he actually gave a damn about. "Because you're my wife," he said finally, "and no one gets to humiliate you, not while I'm still breathing." Vivian stared at him. Her expression caught somewhere between shock and something else entirely. Then she did something Adrian never expected. She smiled, not the polite practiced smile she gave strangers, a real smile. Small, fragile, but real. "Thank you," she said softly. Adrian nodded once, unsure what to say. They stood there in silence, the city sprawling cold and indifferent around them. And somewhere in the back of Adrian's mind, a dangerous thought began to take root. Maybe this marriage wasn't just a transaction anymore. But the war was far from over. 2 days later, a letter arrived at Blackwell Manor, sealed with the royal crest. Adrian opened it in his study, read the contents twice, and felt his blood turn to ice. The Crown had ordered a formal investigation into Lord Ashbourne's financial dealings. If fraud was proven, the entire Ashbourne family would be stripped of their titles, their assets seized, and Edmund Ashbourne would face criminal charges, which meant Vivian's family would be destroyed. And Adrian's marriage, his entire political strategy, would collapse with it. He stared at the letter, his mind racing through possibilities, strategies, contingencies. Then he heard footsteps in the hall. Vivian appeared in the doorway. She looked at his face, then at the letter in his hand. "It's bad, isn't it?" she asked quietly. Adrian didn't answer. Vivian stepped inside and closed the door behind her. "Tell me." So he did. He told her about the investigation, about the charges, about what would happen if her father was found guilty. When he finished, Vivian sank into the chair across from him. Her face was pale, her hands trembling. "They're going to destroy us," she whispered. "Not if I can stop them." "How?" "Adrian, if my father actually committed fraud." "He didn't." Vivian looked up sharply. "How do you know?" "Because I had him investigated before we got married. I don't make alliances without knowing exactly what I'm getting into. Your father is a terrible gambler and an even worse businessman, but he's not a criminal. Someone fabricated evidence to make it look like he is." "Who? Hargrave? Pemberton?" "Maybe both." Adrian leaned forward. "This is a setup. They're trying to force me to annul the marriage to save my reputation. If I do, I lose political leverage. If I don't, I go down with your family. Vivian's jaw tightened. So what do we do? Adrian looked at her, this woman he'd married out of convenience, who'd somehow become the one person in his life he actually trusted, and made a decision. We fight back, he said. How? By proving they fabricated the evidence. And when we do, we'll make sure everyone knows exactly who tried to destroy us. Vivian held his gaze. And if we fail? Then we fail together. The words hung in the air between them, heavier than either of them expected. Vivian stood slowly, walked around the desk, and did something that shocked Adrian completely. She reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were warm, steady. Together, then, she said quietly. Adrian looked down at their joined hands, feeling something shift in his chest, something that terrified him more than any political enemy ever had. Because somewhere in the last 3 weeks, Vivian Ashbourne had stopped being a stranger, and Adrian Blackwell had started to care what happened to her, which meant he'd just made the most dangerous mistake of his life. He'd let someone in. What Adrian doesn't know yet, what neither of them knows, is that the conspiracy against them runs deeper than a few vengeful lords. And the evidence they're looking for? It's locked inside a vault that belongs to the one person Adrian swore he'd never trust again, his dead brother's widow. Adrian hadn't spoken to Isabella Blackwell in 2 years. Not since the funeral. Not since he'd watched his brother's casket lowered into frozen ground while she stood on the opposite side of the grave, veiled in black, silent as death itself. Not since she'd looked at him across that open pit with eyes that said she knew exactly what kind of man he was, and exactly what he'd done to get the title he now wore. She hadn't been wrong, but now he needed her, which meant swallowing pride that had calcified into something closer to bone than ego. Thomas stood in the study doorway, holding the investigative report Adrian had commissioned 3 days ago. His face carried that particular brand of exhaustion that came from delivering bad news to someone who didn't accept defeat. The documents are locked in Henry's personal vault, Thomas said. The one he kept at the townhouse. Isabella is the only person with access. Adrian didn't look up from the contract he was pretending to read. Then we'll get a court order. That'll take weeks, maybe months, and the investigation into Lord Ashbourne moves forward in 6 days. Then we move faster. Adrian. Thomas stepped inside and closed the door. You're going to have to talk to her. The words landed like a fist to the sternum. Adrian's jaw tightened, but he kept his eyes on the page in front of him, the letters blurring into meaningless shapes. No. There's no other option. There's always another option. Not this time. Thomas moved closer, lowering his voice. Isabella has what you need. She's had it since Henry died. Financial records, correspondence, transaction logs, everything that proves your brother was being manipulated by Hargrave's people before he overdosed. If we can show that Henry was coerced into signing those fraudulent documents, we can trace them back to whoever's trying to frame Lord Ashbourne now. Adrian finally looked up. And you think Isabella's just going to hand that over out of the goodness of her heart? No, I think she'll make you pay for it. Then the price is too high. Thomas exhaled slowly, the sound of a man who'd had this conversation before in different forms. You married Vivian to stabilize your position. You stood up for her in front of the entire court. You promised her you'd fight this together, so fight. Even if it means facing the one person you've been avoiding since you took this title. Adrian's hands curled into fists on the desk. He wanted to argue, wanted to find some tactical workaround that didn't involve reopening wounds that had barely scarred over. But Thomas was right. He always was. Fine, Adrian said quietly. Arrange a meeting. Thomas nodded once and left. Adrian sat alone in the study, staring at nothing, feeling the old familiar weight settle back onto his shoulders. The weight of choices made in desperation, of survival purchased at the cost of everything else. Isabella knew what he'd done. She'd always known. And now he was going to have to look her in the eyes and ask for help anyway. Vivian found him an hour later, still sitting in the same position, still staring at the same empty space. She didn't knock, just walked in and closed the door behind her. Thomas told me, she said. Adrian glanced at her. Told you what? That we need your brother's widow to cooperate, and that you'd rather set yourself on fire than ask her for anything. Thomas talks too much. Vivian crossed the room and sat in the chair across from him. She'd changed out of the formal gown she'd worn earlier, now dressed in something simpler. A dark blue dress that made her look less like a duchess and more like the woman she'd been before all this started. It was strange how much Adrian preferred this version. "Why do you hate her?" Vivian asked. "I don't hate her." "Then why haven't you spoken to her in 2 years?" Adrian leaned back in his chair, studying Vivian's face. She wasn't asking out of idle curiosity. She was trying to understand the battlefield they were walking into. Smart. "Because she blames me for Henry's death," Adrian said finally, "and she's not entirely wrong." Vivian's expression didn't change. "Did you kill him?" "Not directly." "That's not an answer." Adrian looked away, jaw tight. He'd never said this out loud, never let anyone close enough to ask the question. But Vivian was already inside the walls, had been since the moment she'd taken his hand 3 days ago and said together. "Henry was weak," Adrian said quietly. "Brilliant, charming, everything our father wanted in an heir, but weak. When he inherited the duchy, he couldn't handle the pressure. Started gambling, then drinking, then opium. I tried to help him, tried to pull him back, but he didn't want to be saved. He wanted to destroy himself, so I stopped trying. And he died. And he died. Alone. In a rented room in the worst part of London, and I inherited everything he couldn't hold on to." Adrian's voice went flat. "Isabella thinks I let him fall because I wanted the title. Maybe she's right. Maybe I could have saved him if I'd tried harder, or maybe he was always going to end up in that grave and all I did was survive." Vivian was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than he expected. "You can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved." Adrian looked at her sharply. "Speaking from experience?" "My father gambled away our entire fortune. I watched him do it. Watched him make the same mistakes over and over, promising each time it would be different. I begged him to stop, threatened to leave. Nothing worked. So eventually I stopped begging and started preparing for the inevitable." She met Adrian's eyes. "That's not weakness. That's survival." Something shifted in Adrian's chest. Not forgiveness, not absolution, but recognition. Vivian understood. "Isabella won't see it that way," Adrian said. "Then we'll convince her." "We?" Vivian stood, smoothing her dress. "You're not doing this alone. If we're asking her for help, we're asking together." Adrian rose slowly, studying her face. "You don't have to—" "Yes, I do, because this isn't just about clearing my father's name anymore. They attacked both of us. They tried to humiliate me in public, destroy my family, and force you to choose between your reputation and your marriage. So now it's personal." Adrian felt something dangerous stir in his chest, something that felt uncomfortably close to pride. "You've changed," he said. "No, I've just stopped pretending I'm not angry." The corner of Adrian's mouth lifted in what might have been a smile. "Anger suits you? Good, because I plan on using it." Isabella Blackwell lived in a townhouse in Belgravia that Henry had purchased during one of his better years. It was elegant, tasteful, and entirely too quiet for a woman who'd once thrown parties that scandalized half of London. Adrian and Vivian arrived at dusk. The sky had gone purple and cold, the kind of November evening that made you want to stay inside by the fire and forget the world existed. Adrian wished he could. The butler, an ancient man named Graves who'd served the Blackwell family longer than Adrian had been alive, opened the door with a face that gave away nothing. "Your Grace, and the new Duchess, Lady Isabella is expecting you." Of course she was. Thomas had sent word ahead. Isabella had probably spent the last 3 hours preparing exactly how she wanted this meeting to go. They followed Graves through halls lined with paintings Adrian recognized from his childhood. Family portraits, landscapes, historical scenes that carried more weight than beauty. Everything in this house belonged to a version of the Blackwell family that no longer existed. The version before Henry's death, before the scandal, before Adrian had claimed a title his brother's ghost still haunted. Isabella waited in the drawing room. She stood by the window with her back to them, silhouetted against the dying light. She'd always had a theatrical streak. This was pure performance, making them wait, making them come to her, establishing dominance before the conversation even started. Adrian had learned that trick from her. "Isabella," he said quietly. She turned. 2 years hadn't diminished her. If anything, she looked sharper, all elegant angles and controlled fury wrapped in mourning black that she still wore like armor. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, her face pale but composed. She looked like a woman who'd learned to weaponize grief. Her eyes landed on Adrian first, cold and assessing, then shifted to Vivian. "So this is the replacement," Isabella said. Vivian stiffened beside him, but her voice stayed level. "Lady Isabella, thank you for agreeing to see us." "I didn't agree to anything. I simply didn't refuse." Isabella moved away from the window, her movements precise and deliberate. "Thomas said you needed access to Henry's vault. I assume this has something to do with the investigation into your father's alleged crimes?" "They're not crimes," Vivian said. "They're fabrications designed to destroy my family and undermine Adrian's position." "How unfortunate for you both." The ice in her voice could have frozen the Thames. Adrian stepped forward. "We need the financial records Henry kept, the ones documenting his dealings with Hargrave's people before he died." Isabella's expression didn't change. "And why would I give you those?" "Because they prove Henry was being manipulated, coerced into signing documents that were later used to build fraudulent financial schemes. If we can trace those schemes to their source, we can prove Lord Ashbourne is being framed by the same people who destroyed your husband." "My husband destroyed himself," Isabella said sharply. "Don't rewrite history to make yourself feel better about inheriting his title." Adrian's jaw tightened. "I'm not here to argue about the past." "No, you're here to use the past. Again." Isabella crossed her arms. "You've spent 2 years avoiding me, Adrian. 2 years pretending I don't exist. And now you show up at my door because you need something. How very predictable." Vivian spoke before Adrian could respond. "You're right. He should have come sooner. He should have faced you after the funeral. He should have done a lot of things differently. But he didn't. And I can't change that. What I can do is tell you the truth. We're out of options. The investigation moves forward in 6 days. If we can't prove those documents are fake, my father goes to prison and Adrian loses everything he's fought to protect. So yes, we're here because we need your help. And yes, it's self-serving, but it's also the truth." Isabella studied Vivian for a long moment, something shifting behind her eyes. "You're not what I expected," she said finally. "Neither are you." A ghost of a smile crossed Isabella's face. Then it vanished. She walked to the sideboard, poured herself a drink, and didn't offer them one. Power move. Adrian recognized it because he'd used it himself 100 times. "The documents exist," Isabella said. "Henry kept meticulous records of everything, especially toward the end. He was paranoid, thought people were conspiring against him. Turns out he was right." "Then you'll give them to us?" Adrian asked. "No." The word landed like a blade. Adrian felt his control start to slip. "Isabella." "I'll give them to her." Isabella nodded toward Vivian. "Not you. Her." Vivian blinked. "I don't understand." "It's very simple. You come back tomorrow. Alone. I'll give you full access to the vault. You can take whatever you need, but Adrian stays away." Adrian's hands clenched at his sides. "That's not acceptable." "Then you don't give the documents." Isabella turned to face him fully. "You want to know why I've held on to these records for 2 years? Because I knew eventually you'd need them. And I wanted to make sure that when you did, you'd have to pay for them. Not with money, with humiliation, with the knowledge that you need me more than I need you. So here's the price, Adrian. You send your wife to beg on your behalf while you sit at home and think about all the ways you failed my husband. That's what it costs." The room went silent. Adrian stared at Isabella, fury building in his chest like a storm. This was deliberate cruelty, calculated revenge. She was forcing him to choose between his pride and Vivian's safety, and she knew exactly what that choice would be. "Fine," Adrian said, the word tasting like ash. Isabella's eyebrows rose slightly. "Really? No argument? No threats? You win. You get your revenge. Just give us what we need." Isabella looked almost disappointed, like she'd been hoping for a fight. Then Vivian spoke. "No," she said quietly. Both Adrian and Isabella turned to stare at her. "No?" Isabella repeated. Vivian stepped forward, positioning herself between Adrian and Isabella. "You're not doing this for revenge. You're doing this because you're scared." Isabella's expression went cold. "Excuse me? You loved Henry, and when he fell apart you couldn't save him, so you've spent 2 years nursing your grief and your anger, telling yourself that Adrian is the villain and you're the victim. But the truth is, You're terrified that if you let go of that anger, you'll have nothing left. So you hold on to these documents like they're a weapon, like they give you power over the man who survived when your husband didn't. Isabella's face had gone pale. You have no right. I have every right. Because I know what it's like to watch someone you love destroy themselves and feel powerless to stop it. I know what it's like to survive when they don't. And I know what it's like to be angry at the world for moving on when you're still drowning. Vivian's voice softened, but didn't lose its edge. But here's what I also know. Holding on to that anger won't bring Henry back. Punishing Adrian won't undo the past. And making me beg for those documents won't make you feel any less empty when we leave. The silence that followed was suffocating. Isabella stared at Vivian like she'd been slapped. Then something broke in her expression. Not tears. Isabella Blackwell didn't cry, but something cracked nonetheless. You don't know anything about me, Isabella said, but her voice had lost its venom. Maybe not, but I know what happens when you let grief turn into poison. It destroys you from the inside out, and I think you're tired of being destroyed. Isabella looked away, her jaw tight, her hands trembling slightly where they gripped her glass. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Isabella set down her drink, walked to the writing desk in the corner, and pulled out a small iron key. She held it out to Vivian. The vault is in the study, second floor. Everything you need is there. Her voice was flat, exhausted. Take it all. I don't want to see it again. Vivian took the key carefully. Thank you. Isabella didn't respond. She'd already turned back to the window, dismissing them both. Adrian and Vivian left without another word. Guts. They didn't speak in the carriage on the way back to Blackwell Manor. Adrian stared out the window at London rushing past in shadows and gaslight, trying to process what had just happened. Vivian had faced down Isabella Blackwell, a woman who'd spent 2 years sharpening her grief into a weapon, and won. Not through threats, not through manipulation, through truth. When they arrived home, Adrian followed Vivian to her chambers. She didn't object, just unlocked the door and let him inside. The room was smaller than his, more intimate. Books stacked on the bedside table, a half-finished letter on the desk. Evidence of a life being built in the spaces he hadn't been watching. Vivian set the key on the dresser and turned to face him. You didn't have to do that, Adrian said. Yes, I did. She would have given us the documents eventually. You didn't need to. She wouldn't have, not unless someone forced her to let go. Vivian crossed her arms. Isabella wasn't trying to hurt you, Adrian. She was trying to hurt herself. And I wasn't going to let her keep doing it. Adrian stared at her, something shifting in his chest. Why do you care what happens to her? Because she's family, and because grief makes people cruel. I've seen it before. I wasn't going to watch it happen again. Family. The word landed strangely. Adrian hadn't thought of Isabella as family in years. Hadn't thought of anyone as family, really, except in the abstract sense of names on a genealogy chart. But Vivian said it like it meant something. You're not what I expected, Adrian said quietly. Vivian smiled faintly. Isabella said the same thing. I mean it. When we got married, I thought you'd be easier to predict. Easier to control, you mean? Yes. And now? Adrian stepped closer, close enough to see the exhaustion in her eyes, the tension in her shoulders, the quiet strength that she wore like steel wrapped in silk. Now, I think I underestimated you, he said. Badly. Vivian held his gaze. Good. Because I'm tired of being underestimated. They stood there in the low lamplight, the space between them charged with something neither of them had names for yet. Then Vivian reached up and touched his face, just her fingertips against his jaw, tentative and careful. We're going to survive this, she said quietly. Both of us. Together. Adrian's hand came up to cover hers, holding it against his skin. Together, he repeated. And for the first time in his life, Adrian Blackwell believed in something other than survival. He believed in her. The next morning, they went to Isabella's townhouse and retrieved every document Henry had hidden away. Financial records, correspondence, transaction logs, letters from men Adrian recognized, Hargrave, Pemberton, a dozen other lords who'd circled Henry like vultures sensing weakness. All of it meticulously documented, all of it proof. They spent 3 days sorting through the evidence, building their case, tracing the conspiracy back to its source. And what they found was worse than Adrian had imagined. The fraud wasn't just about destroying Lord Ashbourne. It was about destabilizing the entire Blackwell Duchy. Hargrave and his allies had been planning this for years, using Henry's weakness, planting false documents, creating financial traps that would eventually collapse and take Adrian's power with them. Vivian's family was just the opening move. They're going to try to dismantle everything you've built, Vivian said, staring at the documents spread across Adrian's desk. Your investments, your political alliances, your reputation. They want to erase the Blackwell name completely. Adrian leaned back in his chair, jaw tight. Then we'll destroy them first. How? By exposing every document, every forged signature, every bribed official. We go to the Royal Council with everything we have, and we force them to choose, protect the conspiracy or protect the Crown's integrity. Vivian looked at him sharply. That's dangerous. If we accuse half of Parliament of fraud without absolute proof, we have absolute proof. Henry documented everything. He was paranoid, but he was thorough. And if they don't believe us, then we make sure the public does. We leak the documents to every newspaper in London. We turn this into a scandal so big they can't bury it. Vivian stared at him for a long moment. You're willing to risk everything. I already did. The moment I married you. The words hung in the air between them. Vivian stood slowly and walked around the desk. She didn't stop until she was standing directly in front of him. Then let's make sure we win, she said. Adrian rose to meet her, and for the first time since this entire nightmare started, he felt something other than cold calculation driving his decisions. He felt certainty. The royal hearing was scheduled for the following Monday. Adrian and Vivian spent the weekend preparing their testimony, rehearsing arguments, anticipating counterattacks. Thomas coordinated with sympathetic members of Parliament. Isabella, surprisingly, sent a letter confirming she would testify about Henry's mental state before his death and the coercion he'd faced from Hargrave's circle. Everything was falling into place. But on Sunday night, 48 hours before the hearing, everything fell apart. Adrian was in his study when Thomas burst through the door, his face ashen. They've arrested Lord Ashbourne, Thomas said, an hour ago. The Crown moved the investigation forward. They're charging him with embezzlement and fraud tomorrow morning. Adrian felt his blood go cold. That's impossible. The hearing isn't until Monday. They changed it. Emergency session. Hargrave pushed it through using some obscure procedural rule. Ashbourne's being held at Newgate Prison until the trial. Where's Vivian? In her chambers. She doesn't know yet. Adrian was already moving. He found Vivian in her sitting room, reading by lamplight. She looked up when he entered, saw his face, and went pale. What happened? She asked. Adrian told her. Vivian stood slowly, the book falling from her hands. They arrested him. Yes. They're going to convict him. Not if we... Adrian. Her voice was steady, but her hands were shaking. If they've already arrested him, the trial is a formality. They'll convict him, seize our assets, strip our titles. My father will die in prison. No, we still have the documents. We can prove... It won't matter. Don't you understand? They control the courts. They control the evidence. They control everything. Vivian's voice cracked. We've already lost. Adrian crossed the room and grabbed her shoulders. Listen to me. We haven't lost, not yet. But I need you to trust me. Trust you to do what? Adrian hesitated. What he was about to propose was dangerous, possibly illegal, definitely career-ending if it failed. But it was the only option left. We don't wait for the trial, Adrian said. We go public. Tonight. We release everything, all the documents, all the evidence, to every newspaper in London. We expose the entire conspiracy before they can control the narrative. Vivian stared at him. That'll start a war. I know. Hargrave and Pemberton will come after you with everything they have. They'll call you a traitor. They'll try to strip your title. They might even arrest you. I know. Adrian, you could lose everything. He held her gaze, his hands steady on her shoulders. I'd rather lose everything fighting than survive by staying silent, he said quietly. Your father doesn't deserve to die in prison for crimes he didn't commit. You don't deserve to watch your family destroyed by men who are too cowardly to face consequences. And I'll be damned if I let them win just because the game is rigged. Vivian's eyes were bright with something that might have been tears. This is insane. Yes, we'll be ruined. Probably. They'll destroy us. They'll try. Vivian took a shuddering breath, then reached up and covered his hands with hers. Then let's burn it all down, she whispered. Adrian felt something fierce and protective surge through his chest. He pulled Vivian close and kissed her. Not the cold, performative kiss from their wedding, but something real and raw and desperate. She kissed him back just as fiercely, her fingers tangling in his hair, her body pressed against his like she was trying to memorize the shape of him. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Adrian rested his forehead against hers. Whatever happens next, he said quietly, we face it together. Together, Vivian repeated. And in that moment, Adrian Blackwell made a choice that terrified him more than any political battle ever had. He chose her. Not strategy, not survival, not power. Her. They worked through the night. Thomas coordinated with contacts at the Times, the Chronicle, and the Morning Post. Isabella sent over additional documents with a note that simply read, "Burn them all." By dawn, every major newspaper in London had received sealed packages containing complete documentation of the conspiracy. Names, dates, forged signatures, financial transactions, testimonies from Henry's final months. Everything. The city woke up to scandal. By noon, Parliament was in chaos. By evening, Hargrave and Pemberton had been summoned before the Royal Council to answer charges of conspiracy and fraud. And by midnight, Lord Edmund Ashbourne had been released from Newgate Prison, all charges dropped. Adrian and Vivian stood on the balcony of Blackwell Manor, watching London burn with the news. Newsboys shouted headlines from street corners, crowds gathered outside Parliament. The entire city was talking about nothing else. We did it, Vivian said quietly. We survived it, Adrian corrected. The real fight starts tomorrow. Because he knew what came next. Hargrave wouldn't go down quietly. Neither would the others. They'd fight back. They'd accuse Adrian of fabricating evidence. They'd try to turn public opinion. They'd use every weapon they had. But for the first time in his life, Adrian wasn't afraid, because he wasn't fighting alone. Vivian leaned against him, her head on his shoulder, and Adrian wrapped his arm around her waist. Whatever they throw at us, he said, we'll handle it. Promise? Promise. But even as he said it, Adrian felt the first stirrings of unease. They'd won the battle, exposed the conspiracy, saved Vivian's father. But in doing so, they'd made enemies of some of the most powerful men in England. And those men didn't forget. They didn't forgive. And they sure as hell didn't lose without taking something down with them. Adrian just didn't know yet that what they'd take would be the one thing he'd finally learned to value more than power. His wife. Power is a house built on sand. You can reinforce the foundation, shore up the walls, convince yourself it's permanent. But the moment the tide comes in, you remember what you've always known. Nothing lasts. Not empires, not alliances, not even love that feels carved from stone. Adrian learned that lesson the hard way. The morning after the scandal broke, London was still reeling. Headlines screamed conspiracy. Parliament was in emergency session. Hargrave and Pemberton were under investigation. Every cafe, every street corner, every drawing room in the city buzzed with the same conversation. The Blackwell documents had exposed corruption at the highest levels of government. Adrian should have felt victorious. Instead, he felt exposed. He stood in his study at dawn, staring at the stack of newspapers Thomas had brought in an hour earlier. The Times had printed excerpts from Henry's letters. The Chronicle had published a timeline of the fraud. The Morning Post had run an editorial calling for criminal trials. They'd won. But winning felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for the ground to crumble. Vivian appeared in the doorway, still in her nightgown, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked younger like this, more vulnerable, less like the woman who'd faced down Isabella Blackwell, and more like the terrified girl who'd walked down the aisle 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks. That's all it had been. It felt like years. You didn't come to bed, she said quietly. Couldn't sleep. Adrian, we won. My father's free. The conspiracy is exposed. Everything we fought for isn't finished. Adrian turned to face her. Hargrave and Pemberton aren't going to accept defeat. They're going to fight back, hard. And when they do, they won't aim for me. They'll aim for you. Vivian crossed the room and took his hand. Her fingers were warm, real, the only solid thing in a world that felt like it was tilting sideways. Then we'll handle it, she said, together, like we always do. Adrian wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that the worst was behind them and all that remained was cleanup and consequences. But he'd been playing this game too long to trust easy victories. Stay close to the manor today, he said. Don't go anywhere without Thomas or the guards. And if anyone approaches you, anyone, I want to know about it immediately. Vivian frowned. You think they'll try something? I think cornered animals are dangerous, and we just backed some very dangerous men into a very tight corner. She nodded slowly, then stood on her toes and kissed him, soft and brief, and somehow more intimate than anything they'd shared before. Be careful, she whispered. Always. But careful wasn't enough, because the trap had already been set. The summons arrived at noon. A royal messenger delivered it personally, a sealed letter bearing the king's crest, requesting Adrian's immediate presence at Westminster Palace. Thomas read it twice, his face going progressively paler. This is bad, he said. It's expected. The Crown needs to address the scandal publicly. I'm one of the primary witnesses. No, this isn't about testimony. Look at the language. Thomas pointed to a specific line. They're summoning you under Article 12 of the Peerage Act. That's only invoked for formal inquiries into a lord's conduct. They're not asking you to testify against Hargrave and Pemberton. They're investigating you. Adrian felt ice slide down his spine. On what grounds? It doesn't say. Which means it's bad enough that they don't want to put it in writing. Adrian grabbed his coat. I'm going. Not alone, you're not. I'm coming with you. No, stay here. Keep Vivian safe. If this is a setup, I don't want her unprotected. Thomas looked like he wanted to argue, but he knew better. He'd worked for Adrian long enough to recognize when an order wasn't negotiable. Adrian left Blackwell Manor 15 minutes later, alone, with a growing sense that he was walking into an ambush he couldn't see. He was right. Westminster Palace was cold and echoing and filled with men who looked at Adrian like he was already convicted. They escorted him to a private chamber. No public gallery, no observers, just a panel of 5 lords seated behind a long oak table. Adrian recognized 3 of them. Lord Chancellor Whitmore, who'd always been neutral. Lord Chief Justice Harrington, who was viciously political. And sitting at the far end, looking smug as a cat with a canary, was Raymond Hargrave. Adrian stopped walking. What is he doing here? Adrian demanded. Whitmore spoke, his voice careful and measured. Lord Hargrave has brought serious allegations against you, Duke Blackwell. As is his right under parliamentary procedure, he's been granted the opportunity to present his case. His case? The man is under investigation for fraud and conspiracy. He doesn't get to what... Sit down, Blackwell. Harrington's voice cracked like a whip. You're here to answer questions, not make demands. Adrian's jaw tightened, but he sat. Every instinct screamed at him to walk out, to refuse this farce of a hearing. But walking out would be seen as guilt, and he couldn't afford that. Hargrave leaned forward, his face the picture of wounded nobility. Your Grace, when you released those documents to the press, you claimed they were proof of a conspiracy to frame Lord Ashbourne and destroy your political position. Is that correct? Yes. And these documents came from your late brother's personal vault? Yes. Documents that only you and Lady Isabella had access to for the past 2 years? Adrian saw the trap closing. What are you implying? Hargrave smiled. I'm not implying anything. I'm stating a fact. You had exclusive access to documents that conveniently prove your innocence and implicate your political enemies. How very fortunate. Those documents are genuine. They're in Henry's handwriting, bearing his seal. Handwriting can be forged. Seals can be recreated. Hargrave pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. What can't be forged is this. Adrian opened the folder. Inside were financial records. His financial records. Transactions dating back 3 years, payments to printers, forgers, document specialists, all of it meticulously documented, all of it pointing to one conclusion. Adrian had fabricated the evidence. These are fake. Adrian said, his voice dangerously quiet. Are they? Because they came from your own bank. Verified by your own financial advisor. A man named Marcus Vell, who's been cooperating with our investigation for the past week. The name hit Adrian like a fist to the gut. Marcus Vell. His financial advisor for 8 years. A man Adrian had trusted with every investment, every transaction, every confidential detail of his fortune. A man who'd apparently been feeding information to Hargrave's people the entire time. This is a setup, Adrian said. Or it's the truth. Harrington leaned forward. Duke Blackwell, did you or did you not pay Marcus Vell to create fraudulent documents implicating members of Parliament in a conspiracy? No. Did you or did you not coordinate with Lady Isabella Blackwell to fabricate evidence against Lord Hargrave and his associates? No. Did you or did you not release forged documents to the press in order to deflect from your own criminal activities? No. Adrian's voice was steel. Everything I released was genuine. Hargrave is lying. Vell is lying. This entire hearing is a coordinated attempt to discredit evidence that proves their guilt. Bold claims. Hargrave's smile widened. But here's the problem, Blackwell. We have witnesses. We have financial records. We have testimony from your own employee. What do you have? Documents that you claim came from a dead man who can't verify their authenticity. The room went silent. Adrian stared at the panel of lords, seeing the calculation in their eyes. They didn't care about truth. They cared about power. And right now, Hargrave was offering them a way to eliminate a threat while maintaining their own positions. They were going to side with him. This is a travesty, Adrian said quietly. This is justice, Harrington replied. Duke Blackwell, until this matter is resolved, you are hereby stripped of your parliamentary seat and placed under house arrest. All assets will be frozen pending a full criminal investigation. You will surrender your seal and remain at Blackwell Manor under guard until trial. Adrian stood slowly. And Lord Ashbourne? The charges against him stand. If your evidence is proven false, he'll be retried and likely convicted. Everything they'd fought for, every risk they'd taken, every document they'd exposed, all of it was being dismantled in front of him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Adrian returned to Blackwell Manor in the back of a guarded carriage, stripped of his parliamentary authority, his finances frozen, his reputation in ruins. The guards followed him inside and positioned themselves at every exit. House arrest, the polite term for imprisonment. He found Vivian in the drawing room, pacing, her face pale. Thomas told me they arrested you, she said. Not arrested, detained. There's a difference. Is there? Her voice cracked. Adrian, what's happening? He told her everything. The hearing, the forged financial records, Marcus Vell's betrayal, the new charges against her father. By the time he finished, Vivian had sunk into a chair, her hands pressed against her mouth. They planned this, she whispered. All of it. The investigation into my father was bait. They wanted us to expose the documents so they could claim we forged them. Yes. And now they have everything they need to destroy us. Yes. Vivian looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears and something darker. Fury. We have to fight back. With what? They've frozen our assets. I'm under house arrest. Half of Parliament thinks I'm a fraud. And the one man who could verify those documents is dead. Then we find another way. We talk to Isabella. We get statements from Henry's former associates. Vivian. Adrian's voice was gentle but firm. It's over. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Vivian stood abruptly, knocking the chair backward. No, I don't accept that. We've fought too hard to give up now. I'm not giving up. I'm being realistic. They outmaneuvered us. We lost. So what, you're just going to let them win? Let my father go to prison? Let them destroy everything we built? I'm trying to keep you safe. Adrian's control finally snapped. Don't you understand? If I keep fighting, they'll come after you next. They'll arrest you as an accomplice. They'll drag you through the same show trial they're planning for me. I won't let that happen. You don't get to make that choice for me. Yes, I do. I'm your husband. And I'm not some fragile thing you need to protect. Vivian's voice was raw. I stood beside you through all of this. I faced Isabella. I helped expose the conspiracy. I risked everything the same as you did. So don't you dare shut me out now because you're scared of what they might do to me. Adrian stared at her, breathing hard, seeing the woman she'd become. fierce and unbreakable, and absolutely terrifying in her determination. "I'm not scared of what they might do to you," he said quietly. "I'm terrified of what I'd become if I lost you." The confession hung between them, raw and honest, and more vulnerable than anything Adrian had ever said out loud. Vivian's expression softened. She crossed the room and took his face in her hands. "Then don't lose me," she said. "Fight with me. Not for me. With me." Adrian closed his eyes, feeling the weight of every decision that had led them here. Every calculation, every risk, every moment he'd chosen strategy over humanity. And he realized that maybe, just maybe, survival wasn't enough anymore. Maybe some things were worth dying for. He opened his eyes and looked at Vivian, really looked at her, and made a choice that would either save them or destroy them both. "All right," he said, "we fight. Together." Vivian smiled, fierce and beautiful and absolutely insane. "Good, because I already have a plan." The plan was dangerous. It was also completely illegal. Vivian laid it out that night in Adrian's study, pacing while she talked, her mind working faster than he'd ever seen. "Marcus Vell is the key," she said. "He's the one who gave Hargrave the forged financial records, which means he has access to the real ones. The ones that prove you never paid for fraudulent documents. Vell isn't going to hand those over. He's working for Hargrave now." "Then we don't ask. We take them." Adrian raised an eyebrow. "You're suggesting we break into Vell's office and steal evidence?" "I'm suggesting we retrieve documents that belong to you in the first place. It's not theft if it's your own property." "That's not how the law works. The law hasn't been working in our favor for weeks. Maybe it's time we stopped playing by their rules." Adrian studied her, seeing the transformation that had happened over the past 6 weeks. The terrified girl at the altar was gone. In her place stood someone who understood that power wasn't given. It was taken. "Even if we get the documents," Adrian said, "I'm under house arrest. There are guards at every exit. I can't leave the manor. You can't, but I can." "Absolutely not." "Adrian, no, I'm not letting you risk—" "You don't get to let me do anything." Vivian slammed her hand on the desk. "I'm going, with or without your permission, because this isn't just about you anymore. It's about my father, my family, everything we've both sacrificed. So either help me plan this properly or get out of my way." Adrian stared at her, torn between admiration and absolute terror. "If you get caught," he said quietly, "they'll arrest you, charge you with breaking and entering, theft, conspiracy. Everything I was trying to protect you from. Then I won't get caught." "Vivian, I can do this." Her voice softened. "I know you're scared. I'm scared too. But I'm also done being a victim. Done watching men like Hargrave destroy lives because they can. Done pretending I'm powerless." She met his eyes. "You taught me that power is taken, not given. So let me take it." And in that moment, Adrian realized he had 2 choices. He could try to stop her, protect her, keep her safe in the gilded cage he'd built. Or he could trust her, really trust her, not as a pawn, not as a political asset, but as a partner, an equal, someone capable of fighting battles he couldn't. He took a deep breath and made the hardest decision of his life. "All right," Adrian said. "Tell me your plan." They spent the next 2 days preparing. Thomas acquired building plans for Vell's office in the financial district. Isabella, surprisingly, sent over a set of lockpicks and a note that read, "Henry used to collect these. Seems appropriate you should have them now." Vivian practiced with the picks until her fingers bled. Adrian coordinated timing, escape routes, contingencies. And on the 3rd night, with storm clouds gathering over London and rain hammering the windows, Vivian prepared to leave. She dressed in dark clothes, men's clothes that Thomas had procured, since women's dresses were too conspicuous for breaking and entering. Her hair was pinned up beneath a cap. She looked like a street thief. Adrian had never been more attracted to her in his life. "The guards change shifts at midnight," he said, reviewing the plan one last time. "That gives you a 3-minute window to slip out through the servants' entrance. Thomas will have a carriage waiting 2 blocks away. Vell's office is in Lombard Street. The night watchman makes rounds every hour. You'll have approximately 40 minutes to find the documents and get out." "I know, we've been over this a dozen times." "I'm aware. I'm also terrified you're going to get caught." Vivian stepped close and kissed him, long and deep and desperate. I'll be back before dawn, she whispered. I promise. Vivian? But she was already moving, slipping out of the study like smoke, disappearing into the darkened halls of Blackwell Manor. Adrian stood alone in the silence, listening to the rain, feeling more powerless than he'd ever felt in his life. Because for the first time, he wasn't in control. He was trusting someone else to save them both. And the waiting was agony. Vivian made it to Vel's office without incident. The building was dark, the streets empty except for rain and shadows. She picked the lock on the back entrance the way Isabella's instructions had taught her, slowly, carefully, listening for the click of tumblers falling into place. It took 3 minutes. She slipped inside. The office was exactly as Thomas had described: rows of filing cabinets, a large desk, windows overlooking the street, everything neat and organized and completely silent. Vivian moved quickly, checking drawers, searching files, looking for anything with Adrian's name on it. She found it in the third cabinet, a folder labeled Blackwell. Adrian, Financial Records 2023 to 2026. Inside were the real documents, the genuine transaction histories, proof that Adrian had never paid anyone to forge evidence. Vivian's hand shook as she pulled the folder free. This was it. This was what they needed. She turned to leave and froze. Someone was standing in the doorway. Marcus Vel stepped into the room, holding a lamp, his face calm and utterly unsurprised. Lady Vivian, he said pleasantly, I was wondering when you'd show up. Vivian's heart slammed against her ribs. You were expecting me? Of course, Lord Hargrave predicted you'd try something like this. He's quite good at predicting desperate people's behavior. Vel set the lamp on the desk. You should have stayed home, Your Grace. Breaking and entering is a serious crime. So is fabricating evidence. I have no idea what you're talking about. The documents you gave Hargrave, the ones claiming Adrian paid you to forge evidence, they're fake, and you know it. Vel smiled. Prove it. Vivian held up the folder. This proves it. These are the real financial records. They show Adrian never made those payments. Interesting. And how exactly did you obtain those records? Vivian's stomach dropped. She'd broken into a private office, picked a lock, stolen documents. Even if they proved Adrian's innocence, she'd committed multiple crimes to get them, which meant they were inadmissible as evidence. And Vel knew it. You set a trap, Vivian said quietly. I set several. You walked into the most obvious one. Vel pulled a cord near the door. Somewhere in the building, a bell rang. I've already summoned the authorities. They'll be here in minutes. You'll be arrested for burglary, theft, and conspiracy. And those documents you're holding, they won't save your husband. They'll just condemn you alongside him. Vivian felt panic rising in her throat. She'd failed. Worse than failed. She'd walked directly into exactly the kind of trap Adrian had warned her about. The sound of boots on stairs echoed from below. The authorities were coming. Vivian had seconds to decide. She could run, try to escape through the back, leave the documents behind, hope she made it out before they caught her. Or she could stay, face arrest. Let them take her and the evidence and pray that somehow it would still be enough. Neither option ended well, but one option ended with Adrian losing everything, and the other ended with both of them going down together. Vivian made her choice. She grabbed the lamp from Vel's desk and hurled it at the filing cabinet. Oil splattered, flames caught, paper ignited. Within seconds, the entire cabinet was burning. Vel screamed and lunged for the fire, trying to smother it. Vivian ran. She crashed through the back door into the rain-soaked alley, clutching the stolen documents against her chest. Behind her, she heard shouting, the crackle of flames, the sound of the building catching fire. She'd just committed arson. She'd destroyed evidence. She'd probably killed whatever chance they had left of proving their innocence. But she'd escaped. Vivian ran through the rain until her lungs burned and her legs shook, until she couldn't hear pursuit anymore, until she collapsed against a wall in an alley 3 blocks away, and sobbed. She'd failed. Everything they'd risked, everything they'd planned, and she'd failed. The documents in her hands were useless now, tainted by the crime she'd committed to obtain them. Even if they proved Adrian's innocence, no court would accept them, and now she was a fugitive. Vivian pressed her face against her knees and let the rain wash over her, feeling the weight of failure crush her chest. She'd promised Adrian she'd come back. She'd promised him they'd win. She'd promised everything would be all right, but promises meant nothing when the world was burning down around you. Adrian knew something was wrong the moment Thomas burst into his study. It was 3 in the morning. Vivian should have been back an hour ago. Thomas's face was ashen. There's been a fire. Lombard Street, Vell's building. Adrian's blood went cold. Where's Vivian? I don't know. The carriage driver said she never returned to the rendezvous point. There are reports of someone fleeing the scene. The authorities are searching the area. Adrian was already moving, grabbing his coat, heading for the door. One of the guards stepped in front of him. You're under house arrest, Your Grace. You can't leave. Get out of my way. I have orders. Adrian didn't wait for the rest. He drove his fist into the guard's face, felt bone crunch, didn't stop to see if the man stayed down. The second guard reached for his weapon, but Thomas was faster, slamming a candlestick into the back of his skull. They ran, out of Blackwell Manor, into the rain-soaked night, with no plan and no idea where Vivian was, or if she was even still alive. Adrian had spent his entire life calculating odds, managing risks, controlling outcomes. But in that moment, running through London's dark streets with nothing but terror driving him forward, he understood something fundamental about power. It was worthless. All the titles, all the political maneuvering, all the strategic brilliance in the world meant nothing if he couldn't protect the one person who'd made any of it matter. And if Vivian was dead or captured or hurt because of choices he'd made, because he'd let her walk into danger, because he'd failed to keep her safe, Adrian pushed the thought away and ran faster. He found her an hour later, huddled in an abandoned warehouse near the docks, soaked to the bone, still clutching the stolen documents, her eyes empty. She looked up when he crashed through the door, and for a moment she just stared at him like she couldn't believe he was real. Then she started crying. Adrian crossed the warehouse in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly he could feel her heart beating against his chest. I failed, she sobbed into his shoulder. I failed you. I destroyed everything. The building caught fire, and Vell knows I was there and the authorities are looking for me, and the documents are useless because I committed crimes to get them, and I don't care about the documents. Adrian, I don't care. He pulled back just enough to look at her face. Do you understand? I don't care about the evidence or the trial or any of it. I care about you, and you're alive. That's all that matters. But they'll arrest me. They'll charge me with arson and burglary, and then we'll face it. Together, like we always do. Vivian stared at him, rain-soaked and trembling and completely broken. I'm sorry, she whispered. Don't be. You were right about fighting back, about refusing to be a victim, about all of it. Adrian brushed wet hair away from her face. I spent so long trying to protect you that I forgot you didn't need protecting. You needed a partner, someone who trusted you to fight your own battles. And I failed at that. Not you, me. We both failed. Then we'll fail together. He kissed her then, there in the abandoned warehouse with London burning around them and their entire world falling apart. And it felt like the only real thing left in a life built on lies and strategy and calculated survival. When they finally pulled apart, Vivian leaned her forehead against his. What do we do now? She asked. Adrian looked down at the documents she still clutched, useless now, tainted by crime, unable to save them, and he made a decision that would change everything. We stop running, he said quietly. We stop trying to fight them on their terms, with their rules, in their courts. We walk away. Vivian pulled back, staring at him. Walk away? Adrian, they'll convict us. They'll strip your title, seize the manor, arrest my father. I know, and maybe there's no way to stop that. Maybe we've already lost. He took her hands. But if we keep fighting this fight, we'll destroy each other in the process. And I'd rather lose everything I own than lose you. You're not making sense. I'm making perfect sense. For the first time in my life. Adrian took a breath. We leave London, tonight. Leave the title, the manor, the duchy, all of it. We disappear. Start over somewhere they can't find us. You'd give up your entire life? My entire life was empty before you walked into it. The title, the power, the political games, none of it mattered. None of it made me anything except alone. He gripped her hands tighter. But you make me want to be more than I am, better than I've been. And if the price of keeping you is walking away from everything else, then that's not a sacrifice. It's a gift. Vivian's eyes were wide, searching his face for some sign that he was lying or playing another angle or calculating some hidden strategy. But Adrian had no strategies left, just truth. "I love you," he said quietly. "I don't know when it happened. Probably somewhere between the wedding and the moment you threatened to fire Margaret Holt. But I do. I love you. And I'm done pretending that anything else matters more than that." Vivian stared at him for one long, breathless moment. Then she kissed him like the world was ending. Because maybe it was. But maybe that meant they were finally free to build a new one. They left London before dawn, two fugitives on a merchant ship bound for France, carrying nothing but stolen documents that would never see a courtroom and a love that had survived everything power could throw at it. Behind them, Parliament would convene. Trials would be held, convictions would be secured. Lord Ashbourne would die in prison 6 months later, his name never cleared. Adrian's title would be stripped. Blackwell Manor would be seized by the Crown. And history would remember the Duke and Duchess who tried to expose corruption and failed spectacularly. But none of that mattered anymore, because Adrian Blackwell had finally learned the one lesson power could never teach. Some things are worth more than survival. Some things are worth everything. And the woman sleeping against his shoulder on that ship, her hand in his, her future uncertain, but her choice finally her own, she was worth the world. There's a specific kind of freedom that comes from losing everything. Not the philosophical kind people talk about in drawing rooms over wine. The real kind. The kind that strips away every careful calculation, every political maneuver, every reason you ever had to care what the world thinks of you. You become dangerous then, not because you're reckless, because you're finally, terrifyingly free to act without the weight of consequences you no longer fear. Adrian discovered that freedom on a gray morning in Paris, 3 months after they'd fled London. They'd been living in a cramped apartment above a bakery in the Marais, surviving on what little money Thomas had managed to smuggle out before the Crown seized everything. Vivian worked as a seamstress. Adrian took jobs translating documents for English merchants too cheap to hire proper scribes. It was honest work. Exhausting work. Work that left them both bone-tired at the end of each day. But they were together, and for 3 months, that had been enough. Then the letter arrived. Adrian found it slipped under their door at dawn, sealed with wax that bore no crest, no identifying marks. He opened it carefully, half expecting some new threat from Hargrave's network. Instead, he found 4 words that changed everything. "Your father is dying." The handwriting was Isabella's. Adrian read it 3 times, feeling something cold and sharp twist in his chest. He hadn't spoken to his father in 4 years, not since the old man had essentially disowned him after Henry's death, calling Adrian a vulture who'd circled his brother's corpse, waiting for the title to fall. His father had been right about that, but dying changed things. Vivian emerged from the bedroom, still in her nightgown, her hair loose around her shoulders. She'd lost weight over the past 3 months. They both had. Poverty did that. But her eyes were clearer than they'd ever been in London. She saw the letter in his hand and crossed the room. "What is it?" Adrian handed it to her without speaking. Vivian read it, then looked up at him. "When?" "It doesn't say. Just that he's dying." "Are you going back?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Going back to London meant walking directly into the trap they'd fled. Adrian was a fugitive. Vivian was wanted for arson and theft. The moment they set foot in England, they'd be arrested. But his father was dying, and despite everything, despite the years of coldness, the accusations, the complete severing of their relationship, Adrian felt something pull at him. Not love, exactly. Something older than that. Something primal. Blood. "I don't know," Adrian said quietly. Vivian set the letter down and took his hands. "He never defended you. When Parliament stripped your title, when Hargrave accused you of fraud, your father stayed silent. Let them destroy you without saying a word." "I know. So why would you go back for him now?" Adrian looked at their joined hands, hers rough from seamstress work, his scarred from the manual labor he'd been doing at the docks. These weren't the hands of a duke and duchess anymore. These were the hands of people who'd survived. "Because he's my father," Adrian said finally, "and because I need to know if there's anything left worth salvaging. Not the title, not the duchy. Just closure, I guess." Vivian studied his face for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly. Then we go together. Vivian, if we're caught, then we're caught together, like everything else. She squeezed his hands. You don't get to face this alone. Not anymore. Adrian felt something in his chest crack open, not breaking, but expanding, making room for this woman who'd chosen him over safety, over comfort, over every reasonable option she'd ever had. All right, he said quietly. We go together. They left Paris that afternoon. The crossing from Calais to Dover was brutal. Winter storms hammered the channel, turning the 2-hour journey into 6 hours of violent waves and freezing rain. Vivian spent most of it below deck, too sick to move. Adrian stayed with her, holding her hair back while she vomited, wiping her face with a damp cloth, whispering reassurances he wasn't sure he believed. When they finally reached Dover, both of them looked like drowned rats. They hired a coach to London using the last of their savings, traveling at night to avoid recognition. The driver was a taciturn old man who asked no questions and seemed perfectly content to drive 2 suspicious-looking passengers through the dark. Smart man. They reached the outskirts of London just before dawn. The city looked different, darker somehow. Or maybe Adrian had just forgotten what it felt like to see the place that had destroyed him. The buildings loomed like tombstones. The streets felt narrower. The air tasted like coal smoke and old grudges. This wasn't home anymore. It was a battlefield he'd barely escaped. Where is he? Vivian asked quietly. The family estate, Ashford Hall, about 2 hours north of the city. Will they let us in? Probably not, but I'm not asking for permission. The coach turned north, following roads Adrian knew by heart. He'd grown up on these roads, learned to ride on them, memorized every turn, every landmark, every shortcut between the estate and London proper. Strange how muscle memory survived even when everything else had been stripped away. They reached Ashford Hall as the sun broke over the horizon. The estate looked exactly as Adrian remembered. Massive stone walls, manicured gardens now covered in frost, windows dark except for a few scattered lights that suggested servants moving through morning routines. The place had been in the Blackwell family for 11 generations. Adrian had spent his childhood here. His brother had died knowing he'd lost it. And now Adrian was back, a ghost visiting his own history. The coach stopped at the main gate. Guards appeared immediately, 2 of them, wearing Blackwell livery that technically no longer belonged to Adrian. They recognized him instantly. Adrian saw it in their faces. The shock, the calculation, the brief moment where they decided whether to raise the alarm or pretend they hadn't seen anything. Adrian stepped out of the coach before they could make that decision. I'm here to see my father, he said quietly. The older guard, a man named Davies who'd worked for the family for 30 years, stared at him. Your Grace, you're a fugitive. I know. And if you raise that alarm, I'll be arrested before I make it to the front door. But my father is dying and I'm going to see him before that happens. So you can either let me through or try to stop me. Your choice. Davies looked at the second guard, then back at Adrian. Then he stepped aside. You have an hour, Davies said quietly. After that, I report this to the steward. What he does with the information is his business. Adrian nodded once. Thank you. Vivian followed him through the gates, both of them moving quickly across the frost-covered grounds toward the main house. They didn't make it halfway before the front doors opened and someone stepped out. Isabella Blackwell stood on the steps, wrapped in a black shawl, her face pale but composed. She looked at Adrian, then at Vivian, then back at Adrian. You came, she said. You knew I would. I hoped. Knowing and hoping are different things. Isabella descended the steps slowly. He's in the East Wing, 2nd floor. The doctors say he has days at most. Maybe hours. What's killing him? His heart. Turns out decades of rage and bitterness take a toll. Isabella's voice was flat, clinical. He's been asking for you, not Henry. You. I thought you should know that before you go up there. Adrian felt something twist in his chest. Why did you send for me? Because despite everything he said about you, despite how he treated you after Henry died, you're still his son. And he deserves the chance to make peace before he dies, even if he doesn't deserve forgiveness. The words landed like stones. Adrian looked at Isabella, this woman who'd hated him for 2 years, who'd blamed him for her husband's death, who'd made him grovel for documents just to watch him suffer. and saw something he'd never expected. Compassion. "Thank you," Adrian said quietly. Isabella nodded once. "He's waiting. Don't waste what time he has left." The east wing was quiet, except for the sound of labored breathing. Adrian found his father in the same bedroom the old man had occupied for 40 years. The curtains were drawn. A single lamp burned on the bedside table. And in the massive four-poster bed that had always made the room feel like a throne room, Lord Richard Blackwell lay dying. He looked smaller than Adrian remembered, shrunken, the kind of fragile that came from a body slowly shutting down. But his eyes were still sharp when they fixed on Adrian standing in the doorway. "So you came back," Richard said. His voice was barely a whisper. "Isabella said you were asking for me." "Isabella says a lot of things. Most of them true." Richard gestured weakly toward a chair. "Sit. I don't want to spend my last conversation yelling across the room." Adrian sat. Vivian stayed by the door, giving them space but refusing to leave completely. Richard's gaze shifted to her, then back to Adrian. "That your wife? The Ashbourne girl?" "Yes." "She's the reason you ran. She's the reason I survived." Richard made a sound that might have been a laugh or a cough, hard to tell. "You always were better at surviving than your brother. He had the heart. You had the spine. I used to think that made you the weaker son. I was wrong about that." Adrian stared at his father, unsure how to respond. "Henry would have made a terrible duke," Richard continued. "Too soft. Too desperate to be loved. You, though, you were always willing to do what needed to be done, even if it made people hate you. Is that supposed to be a compliment? It's supposed to be the truth, which is more than I gave you when you needed it." Richard's breathing hitched. He closed his eyes for a moment, gathering strength. "When they accused you of fraud, I stayed silent. Let them strip your title, destroy your reputation, didn't say a damn word in your defense. I remember. I did it because I was angry. Angry that you survived when Henry didn't. Angry that you got the title he was supposed to have. Angry that the world kept moving forward when my favorite son was dead." Richard opened his eyes again. "But anger doesn't bring back the dead. It just kills what's left of the living, and I wasted 4 years being angry at the wrong son." The confession hung in the air, raw and painful. Adrian felt his throat tighten. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I'm dying, and because you deserve to hear it before I'm gone." Richard lifted one trembling hand. "Come here." Adrian hesitated, then leaned forward. His father gripped his hand with surprising strength. "I was wrong about you," Richard whispered. "About everything. You're not a vulture, you're a survivor. And that's not weakness. That's the only thing that matters, in the end." Adrian felt something break inside his chest. Not pain exactly, but the release of pressure he'd been carrying for so long he'd forgotten it was there. "I'm sorry I wasn't the son you wanted," Adrian said quietly. "I'm sorry I wasn't the father you deserved." They sat there in silence, hands clasped, while the lamp burned low and the morning light began creeping through the curtains. Then Richard's grip went slack. His breathing stopped, and Adrian's father died exactly the way he'd lived, refusing to show weakness until the very end. The funeral was private. Just Adrian, Vivian, Isabella, and a handful of servants who'd known Richard for decades. No grand ceremony, no political theater, just a quiet burial in the family plot beside Henry's grave. Adrian stood at the graveside, staring at the coffin being lowered into frozen ground, feeling nothing and everything at once. Vivian's hand found his. He gripped it like an anchor. When it was over, Isabella approached him in the empty graveyard. "What will you do now?" she asked. "I don't know. Go back to Paris, I suppose. There's nothing left for me here." "There could be." Adrian looked at her sharply. "What are you talking about?" Isabella pulled an envelope from her coat and handed it to him. "Your father left a will. He had it revised 3 weeks ago, right after he got sick." "Read it." Adrian opened the envelope with numb fingers. Inside was a single page written in his father's shaky handwriting. "To my son Adrian, I bequeath the entirety of my personal fortune, all properties not seized by the crown, and all legal rights to challenge the parliamentary ruling that stripped your title. Fight for what's yours, and this time I'll be the one defending you, even if it's from beyond the grave." Adrian read it twice, his heart pounding. "He liquidated everything," Isabella explained. Sold off assets the crown hadn't gotten to yet. Converted it all to cash and put it in a trust under my name. Nearly £500,000. It's yours. All of it. Along with documented proof that the financial records Hargrave used to convict you were forged. Your father spent his last 3 weeks gathering evidence, taking testimonies, building a case that could overturn the ruling. Adrian stared at the document in his hands, unable to process what he was reading. Why? He whispered. Because he realized too late that he'd failed you when you needed him most, and he wanted to give you the one thing he'd never given you before, a fighting chance. Adrian looked up at Isabella, then at Vivian, then back at the paper trembling in his hands. A fighting chance. The thing he'd been denied his entire life. The thing he'd stopped believing existed. And now, from beyond the grave, his father was offering it to him. If I use this, Adrian said slowly, if I challenge the ruling and go back to Parliament, they'll come after me with everything they have. Hargrave, Pemberton, everyone who wants to see the Blackwell name erased. It'll be war. Yes, Isabella said. It will be. And I could lose, again, worse than before. You could, or you could win, and reclaim everything they took from you. Adrian looked at Vivian. She was watching him with those clear eyes that had seen him at his worst and chosen to stay anyway. What do you want to do? She asked quietly. It was such a simple question, and such an impossible one, because what Adrian wanted and what was safe were two completely different things. Going back to Paris meant survival, anonymity, peace, a life free from the constant battle for power and position. But it also meant letting Hargrave win, letting his father's sacrifice mean nothing, letting everyone who'd ever doubted him, betrayed him, or destroyed him walk away without consequences. Adrian had spent 3 months learning to live without power, but he'd never stopped being angry about how he'd lost it. I want to fight, Adrian said finally. I want to walk back into Parliament, look Hargrave in the eyes, and watch him realize that destroying me was the biggest mistake he ever made. I want my title back, my reputation back, everything they took from me. I want it all back. Vivian smiled, fierce and beautiful and absolutely terrifying. Then let's go to war, she said. They returned to London 2 days later. Not as fugitives sneaking through shadows, but as a duke and duchess who'd come to reclaim their legacy. Adrian used his father's fortune to hire the best solicitors in England. He secured parliamentary allies who'd been waiting for an opportunity to take down Hargrave. He leaked carefully curated evidence to newspapers, building public support before the official challenge even began. And on a cold January morning, 3 weeks after his father's funeral, Adrian Blackwell walked into the House of Lords for the first time in 4 months. The room went silent. Every eye turned toward him. Adrian saw Hargrave at the far end of the chamber, his face going pale. Pemberton beside him, looking like he'd seen a ghost. Half a dozen other lords who'd voted to strip Adrian's title, all of them realizing in that moment that they'd made a catastrophic miscalculation. They'd thought Adrian was finished. They'd thought he'd stay buried. They'd forgotten the most important rule of power. Never assume your enemy is defeated until you've seen the body. And Adrian Blackwell was very much alive. The Lord Chancellor stood. Duke Blackwell, you were not expected. I'm aware. I'm here to formally challenge the ruling that stripped my title and seized my assets. I have new evidence proving the charges against me were fabricated, along with testimony from multiple witnesses confirming that Lord Hargrave and his associates conspired to frame me for crimes I did not commit. The chamber erupted. Voices shouted over each other. Lords demanded order. Hargrave was on his feet, face red with fury. This is outrageous, Hargrave bellowed. Blackwell is a convicted criminal. He has no standing to— I was never convicted, Adrian said, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. I was accused, investigated, and condemned without trial, but I was never actually convicted in a court of law, which means legally, I still hold my title, and legally, you have no authority to keep it from me. The Lord Chancellor looked like he wanted to disappear, because Adrian was right. In their rush to destroy him, they'd skipped the actual trial, stripped his title through parliamentary vote, but never formalized criminal charges. It was a technicality, but it was also a loophole big enough to drive an army through. I demand a full hearing, Adrian continued, with all evidence presented publicly, Every document, every witness, every lie that's been told about me and my family. And when we're done, when the truth is finally on record, I expect full restoration of my title, my assets, and my seat in this chamber." He paused, letting the words sink in. Then he looked directly at Hargrave. "And I expect criminal charges filed against everyone who participated in the conspiracy to destroy me." The silence that followed was absolute. Hargrave stared at him with undisguised hatred. Adrian stared back with cold, controlled fury. This was it. The moment everything had been building toward. Not just the last 4 months. The last 4 years. His entire life. Every humiliation, every loss, every time he'd been underestimated, betrayed, or destroyed. All of it came down to this. The Lord Chancellor cleared his throat. "This chamber will vote on whether to grant Duke Blackwell's petition for a formal hearing." The vote took 15 minutes. It passed. Barely. But it passed. Adrian had his hearing, and in 2 weeks he'd either reclaim everything he'd lost or lose it all permanently. The next 13 days were brutal. Adrian and his legal team worked around the clock, organizing evidence, preparing witnesses, anticipating every possible counterargument Hargrave could throw at them. Vivian coordinated with Isabella, securing testimony from former servants who'd witnessed Henry's coercion. They tracked down Marcus Vell's former colleagues who confirmed the financial records had been altered. They built a case so airtight that even Parliament couldn't ignore it. But Hargrave wasn't sitting idle either. 2 days before the hearing, Adrian received word that someone had broken into his solicitor's office and stolen half their evidence. The next day, 3 of their key witnesses recanted their testimony, clearly intimidated or bribed. Then, on the morning of the hearing, Thomas burst into Adrian's temporary lodgings with news that made his blood run cold. "They've arrested Vivian," Thomas said. Adrian felt the world tilt sideways. "What?" "An hour ago. Charges of arson and burglary related to the fire at Vell's office. They're holding her at Newgate Prison pending trial." Adrian was already moving, grabbing his coat, heading for the door. Thomas grabbed his arm. "Adrian, if you go to her now, you'll miss the hearing. The vote happens in 3 hours. If you're not there—" "I don't care about the vote." I thought. "Yes, you do. And so does she. This is what Hargrave wants. He's trying to force you to choose between your wife and your title. Don't give him that satisfaction." Adrian stopped, his hand on the door handle, his entire body vibrating with the need to move, to act, to do something other than stand here while Vivian was locked in a cell. But Thomas was right. This was a trap, and walking into it would destroy everything they'd fought for. "Send word to the prison," Adrian said, his voice dead. "Tell them I'm coming for her the moment the hearing is over, and tell Vivian," his voice cracked, "tell her I'm sorry and that I love her, and that this will be over soon." Thomas nodded and left. Adrian stood alone in the empty room, hands shaking, feeling the weight of the choice crushing his chest. Save his wife or save his legacy. The kind of choice that broke men. The kind of choice he'd been avoiding his entire life. But there was no avoiding it now. The hearing began at noon in a packed parliamentary chamber. Adrian sat at the front, flanked by his legal team, staring at the panel of lords who would decide his fate. Hargrave sat across from him, smug and confident. Pemberton beside him. A dozen other enemies arrayed like an execution squad. The Lord Chancellor called the chamber to order. "We are here to review the evidence in the matter of Adrian Blackwell, Duke of Blackwell, who petitions for restoration of his title and assets. Duke Blackwell, you may present your case." Adrian stood, every eye in the room fixed on him, and in that moment, standing in front of the men who destroyed him, with his wife locked in a cell and his entire future balanced on a knife's edge, Adrian made a decision. He wasn't going to play by their rules anymore. He wasn't going to present evidence carefully, argue points of law, hope for mercy from men who had none. He was going to burn it all down. "My lords," Adrian began, his voice carrying to every corner of the chamber. "I could stand here and present documents proving my innocence. I could call witnesses confirming that I was framed. I could argue legal technicalities until we're all too old to care. But I'm not going to do that, because this hearing isn't about evidence. It's about power, and who gets to wield it." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Adrian kept going. "Lord Hargrave and his associates didn't frame me because I committed crimes. They framed me because I was inconvenient, because I refused to play their game, because I stood in the way of their ability to manipulate Parliament for their own profit. So they invented charges, fabricated evidence, and destroyed my reputation. Not because it was just, because it was easy. That's a lie. Hargrave was on his feet. Is it? Then explain why Marcus Vell, your key witness, fled to France the day after this hearing was announced. Explain why 3 witnesses who were prepared to testify against you suddenly recanted their statements yesterday. Explain why my solicitor's office was robbed 2 days ago and only documents related to this case were stolen. The chamber went silent. Adrian pulled a folder from his coat and held it up. This contains financial records proving that Vell was paid by Hargrave's office to fabricate evidence against me. It contains testimony from former colleagues confirming that the documents used to convict me were forged. And it contains correspondence between Hargrave, Pemberton, and 6 other lords in this chamber detailing their conspiracy to frame not just me, but dozens of other politically inconvenient nobles over the past 5 years. He threw the folder onto the table in front of the Lord Chancellor. You want evidence? There it is. Read it, verify it, and then ask yourselves if you're willing to let this corruption continue just because it's easier than holding powerful men accountable. The silence was deafening. Then Hargrave laughed. It was a cold, bitter sound. Very dramatic, Blackwell. But you're forgetting one important detail. He gestured toward the guards at the door. Your wife is in prison, charged with serious crimes, and unless you withdraw this petition immediately, I'll make sure she's convicted and spends the rest of her life locked in a cell. Adrian felt his blood turn to ice. There it was, the real trap. Withdraw and save Vivian, or proceed and watch her destroyed. The entire chamber held its breath, waiting to see what he would choose. Adrian looked at Hargrave, then he smiled. It was not a kind smile. You think threatening my wife gives you leverage, Adrian said quietly. But here's what you don't understand. I've already lost everything once. My title, my fortune, my reputation. I spent 3 months living in poverty in Paris. And you know what I learned? I don't need any of this. He gestured around the chamber. I don't need the title. I don't need the power. I don't need your approval or your fear. All I need is her. And if the price of having her is walking away from all of this and letting you corrupt bastards continue destroying innocent people, then I'll pay that price, gladly. Adrian turned toward the door. But before I do, I'm going to make sure everyone in London knows exactly what you are. Every newspaper, every tavern, every street corner. I'm going to tell them about this hearing, about your threats, about how you held my wife hostage to protect your corruption. And when I'm done, you won't have power anymore. You'll have infamy, and that's a prison you can't escape. He started walking toward the exit. Wait. The Lord Chancellor's voice stopped him. Duke Blackwell, if you leave now, you forfeit your petition. I know. Your title will be permanently revoked, all assets seized. You'll never be able to challenge this ruling again. I know. And Lord Hargrave's charges against your wife will proceed. Adrian turned back slowly. Then I guess we're done here. But before he could take another step, the chamber doors burst open. Isabella Blackwell strode in, followed by Thomas, and behind them, Vivian. Adrian's heart stopped. She was pale, exhausted, still wearing the prison dress they'd given her, but she was walking. She was free, and she was looking at him with eyes that said everything. What? Adrian couldn't form words. Isabella stepped forward holding a document. Emergency writ of habeas corpus. Signed by the king himself an hour ago. Vivian's arrest was illegal. No formal charges were ever filed, no warrant properly issued. Hargrave overstepped his authority. Again. She turned to face the chamber. And since we're all here, I might as well share something else. My late husband kept detailed records of every corrupt deal Lord Hargrave ever made. Every bribe. Every threat. Every law he broke. I've spent the last 2 weeks compiling them into a formal complaint, which I submitted to the Crown this morning, along with testimony from 15 former associates willing to testify against him. Hargrave's face had gone white. You're lying, he whispered. Am I? Then explain why there are royal guards waiting outside to arrest you the moment this hearing concludes. As if on cue, armed guards appeared in the doorway. The chamber erupted into chaos. Adrian stood frozen, staring at Vivian, unable to believe she was real. She was here. She was safe. She crossed the room and took his hand. Told you, she whispered. Together. Adrian pulled her into his arms and held her like she might disappear if he let go. Around them, Hargrave was being escorted out in chains, Pemberton was shouting denials, and the entire corrupt network they'd been fighting was finally, spectacularly, collapsing. The Lord Chancellor banged his gavel, trying desperately to restore order. "This chamber will vote," he announced, "on the petition to restore Duke Adrian Blackwell to his full title and position." The vote was unanimous. Adrian barely heard it. He was too busy holding his wife, feeling her heartbeat against his chest, realizing that for the first time in his life, he'd won something that actually mattered. Not power, not position, her. And as the chamber erupted in applause and condemnation and chaos, as his enemies fell and his allies celebrated, and the world rearranged itself around the truth he'd fought so hard to expose, Adrian Blackwell finally understood what his father had been trying to tell him. Surviving wasn't enough. You had to know what you were surviving for. And he'd just found his answer. There's a moment after every war when the battlefield goes quiet and you're left standing in the wreckage, trying to remember who you were before the fighting started. Victory doesn't feel the way you imagined it would. It doesn't erase the scars or undo the damage or bring back what you lost along the way. It just gives you permission to stop running and face what you've become in the pursuit of survival. That's the hardest part. Not the fighting, the reckoning that comes after. Adrian learned that the night they reclaimed Blackwell Manor. The Crown had returned the estate along with his title, his assets, and a formal apology that meant nothing compared to the 3 months they'd spent in exile. But the manor was theirs again. The servants had been rehired. The gardens were being restored. Everything looked exactly as it had before the world had tried to erase them, except nothing was the same. Adrian stood in the main hall at midnight, surrounded by furniture covered in dust cloths, listening to the echo of his footsteps on marble floors that felt more like a mausoleum than a home. Vivian had gone to bed hours ago, exhausted from the hearing and the days of testimony that had followed. Isabella had returned to her townhouse. Thomas was coordinating with the steward to get the household running again, and Adrian was alone with his victory, trying to figure out why it felt so hollow. He walked through the manor like a ghost haunting his own life, the library where he'd planned their defense, the study where he'd learned his father was dying, the drawing room where he'd first realized he was falling in love with a woman he'd married for political convenience. Every room carried memories now, not the old ones from childhood, new ones, forged in crisis, built on the kind of foundation that didn't crumble the first time the wind changed direction. But they'd paid for those memories in blood and reputation and 3 months of poverty that had stripped away every illusion about what mattered. Adrian reached the east wing, Vivian's chambers from those first cold weeks of marriage, and pushed open the door. The room was exactly as she'd left it, books still stacked on the bedside table. The letter she'd been writing still unfinished on the desk, evidence of a woman who'd thought she'd be coming back. But they'd both left different people. And Adrian wasn't sure the people they'd become fit in this house anymore. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to find Vivian standing in the hallway, wrapped in a robe, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked at the room, then at him. "You couldn't sleep either," she said quietly. "No." She crossed the threshold and stood beside him, both of them staring at the ghost of who they used to be. "This feels wrong," Vivian said. "Being back here. Like we're trying to step into lives that don't belong to us anymore." Adrian nodded, because she was right. The Duke and Duchess who'd fled London 4 months ago had been running from a system designed to destroy them. The people standing here now had survived that destruction and built something else from the wreckage. "You could go back to Paris," Adrian said, "if that's what you want. We have money now, resources. You could have the life we started building there, without all of this." He gestured at the manor, the title, the weight of expectation that came with being Blackwell. Vivian turned to look at him, her eyes clear and unflinching. "Is that what you want?" she asked. "I don't know what I want anymore. I spent my entire life fighting for this title, this position. And now that I have it back, all I can think about is how much lighter I felt when I didn't. Then let it go." The words landed like a physical blow. Adrian stared at her. "What?" "Let it go," Vivian repeated. "The title, the duchy, all of it. We don't need it anymore. We proved we could survive without it. So if it's making you miserable, walk away. I can't just—" "Why not? We already did it once. We could do it again. Better this time, since we're not fugitives." Adrian felt something crack in his chest. Because it's my family's legacy. 11 generations of Blackwells built this. My father died trying to give me the tools to reclaim it. I can't just throw that away. Even if keeping it destroys you? The question hung in the air between them, brutal and honest. Adrian looked at Vivian, this woman who'd married him out of desperation, who'd learned to fight beside him, who'd chosen him over safety every single time, and realized she was offering him something more valuable than any title. Freedom. Real freedom. Not the hollow kind that came from losing everything. The earned kind that came from choosing what mattered. What if I don't want to choose? Adrian asked quietly. What if I want both? The title and the life we built in Paris. The power and the peace? Then you'll spend the rest of your life torn between them. And eventually, you'll have to decide which one you can't live without. Adrian turned away, staring at the empty room, feeling the weight of the choice pressing down on him. He'd spent his entire life believing power was the only thing worth having, that survival meant accumulating enough control to protect yourself from a world designed to crush you. He'd sacrificed relationships, morality, and nearly his own humanity in pursuit of that control. And for what? A title that could be stripped away by a parliamentary vote. Assets that could be seized. A reputation built on fear that crumbled the moment people stopped being afraid. None of it had saved him when it mattered. The only thing that had was her. I don't know how to be both, Adrian admitted. The man who fought for this title and the man who learned to live without it. They're two different people, and I don't know how to reconcile them. Vivian stepped closer and took his hand. Then don't, she said. Be someone new. Someone who isn't defined by what you've lost or what you've won. Someone who gets to decide what matters without carrying the weight of what everyone else expects. Adrian looked down at their joined hands, scarred from Paris, stronger than they'd been in London, real in a way nothing else in this house felt. I don't know if I can do that, he said. Neither do I. But we could try, together. The word had become their anchor, the thing they returned to every time the world tried to pull them apart, together. Adrian pulled Vivian close and held her, feeling her heartbeat against his chest, breathing in the scent of her hair, grounding himself in the one solid thing left in his life. All right, he whispered. We'll try. Cham. The next morning, Adrian called a meeting with the Lord Chancellor. They met in neutral territory, a private club in Westminster where political deals were made over brandy and cigars. The Chancellor arrived looking wary, probably expecting Adrian to make demands or threaten reprisals against the lords who'd voted to strip his title. Instead, Adrian made an offer that clearly caught him off guard. I want to negotiate the terms of my restoration, Adrian said. The Chancellor frowned. Your restoration is already complete. The Crown returned everything, not everything. They returned the title and the assets, but they didn't address the structural corruption that allowed Hargrave and his circle to operate unchecked for years. That's being investigated by the same system that enabled it in the first place. Adrian leaned forward. Here's what I'm proposing. I'll accept my title and position, but in exchange, I want parliamentary reform. Real reform. Independent oversight of financial dealings, mandatory disclosure of all political donations, criminal penalties for lords who abuse their authority. The Chancellor stared at him like he'd suggested burning down Parliament. That's ambitious. That's necessary. Hargrave wasn't an anomaly. He was a symptom of a system designed to protect corruption. And if we don't fix it, someone else will just step into his place and continue destroying lives for profit. And if I refuse, then I publicly resign my title and spend the rest of my life campaigning for reform from outside the system. Either way, change is coming. You just get to decide whether it happens with your cooperation or over your objections. The Chancellor was quiet for a long moment, clearly calculating the political cost of both options. Finally, he sighed. You're making a lot of enemies with this approach, Duke Blackwell. I've had enemies my entire life. At least now I'm making them for the right reasons. The Chancellor nodded slowly. I'll bring your proposal to the Council. No promises. That's all I'm asking. They shook hands, and Adrian left feeling lighter than he had in years. Because for the first time, he wasn't fighting for personal power. He was fighting for something bigger than himself. Something that might actually matter when he was gone. Chug. The reforms took 6 months to pass. 6 months of brutal political warfare, late-night sessions, parliamentary debates that turned into shouting matches, death threats delivered to Blackwell Manor with alarming regularity. But Adrian had learned something in Paris that his enemies hadn't. He'd learned how to lose. And once you've lost everything and survived it, threats stop working. Because the worst they could do had already happened. They'd stripped his title, frozen his assets, arrested his wife, forced him into exile. And he'd come back stronger. So when lords threatened to vote against him, Adrian smiled and reminded them the public was watching. When anonymous letters promised violence, he published them in newspapers alongside editorials about corruption. When bribes were offered to make the reforms disappear, he exposed every single one. He fought dirty, but he fought for something worth the dirt. And in the end, Parliament passed the Transparency and Accountability Act by a narrow margin. It wasn't everything Adrian had wanted. It had been watered down, compromised, amended to protect certain interests. But it was real. It created independent oversight. It mandated financial disclosure. It established penalties for abuse of power. It was a start. The night the vote passed, Adrian and Vivian stood on the balcony of Blackwell Manor, watching London spread out below them in gaslight and shadow. "You did it," Vivian said quietly. "We did it." She smiled. "Still doesn't feel real. It will. Eventually." They stood in comfortable silence, the kind that came from weathering storms together and finding calm on the other side. "What happens now?" Vivian asked. Adrian considered the question. 6 months ago, he would have said, consolidate power, eliminate remaining enemies, strengthen position, the language of someone who saw life as a constant battle. But he was tired of fighting. "Now?" he said. "Now we live. We rebuild the parts of this estate that matter and let go of the parts that don't. We travel. We find out what we actually enjoy when we're not fighting for survival. We figure out who we are when the war is over." Vivian leaned against him. "That sounds terrifying." "It does, doesn't it? But also kind of perfect." Adrian wrapped his arm around her waist and pulled her close. For the first time in his life, he wasn't planning the next battle, wasn't calculating the next move, wasn't preparing for the next threat. He was just standing with his wife, watching the city they'd conquered and survived and somehow learned to live in again. And it was enough. 3 weeks later, Vivian told him she was pregnant. They were in the gardens, the ones she'd been slowly bringing back to life over the past 6 months, when she said it. Just dropped the information casually, like she was commenting on the weather. Adrian stopped walking. "What?" "I'm pregnant." "About 2 months, the doctor thinks." Adrian stared at her, his brain refusing to process the words. We're going to have a baby." Yes, 1,000 thoughts crashed through his mind at once. Fear, joy, terror, wonder. The realization that he was going to be a father. Him, the man who'd spent his entire life focused on power and survival and control. "How long have you known?" he asked. "A week. I wanted to be sure before I told you. And you're happy about this?" Vivian smiled. Not the polite social smile she gave strangers, but the real one she saved for him. Terrified, she said, "But yes, happy." Adrian crossed the distance between them and pulled her into his arms, holding her carefully, like she might break. A baby. Their baby. A life they'd created not out of political calculation or social obligation, but out of something real. "I don't know how to be a father," Adrian admitted quietly. "Good. Neither of us knows how to be parents. We'll figure it out together." There was that word again. Together. Adrian pulled back just enough to look at her face, memorizing this moment, the afternoon light, the smell of roses from the garden, the way her eyes reflected both fear and hope. "I love you," he said. "I don't say it enough, but I do. More than I knew I was capable of." Vivian's eyes went bright. "I know," she whispered, "and I love you, even when you're impossible, even when you're self-destructive, even when you make me want to throw things at your head. I love you." They stood there in the garden, wrapped in each other, while the world moved around them, and the future they'd been so carefully avoiding finally became impossible to ignore. The baby was born on a cold February morning. A girl. tiny and red-faced and howling with the kind of fury that suggested she'd inherited her mother's temper. Adrian held her for the first time in the same room where he'd watched his father die, feeling the weight of her in his arms, barely 7 pounds of humanity that somehow carried the entire future of the Blackwell line. She looked nothing like him, had Vivian's dark hair and sharp features and that expression of absolute determination even at 3 hours old. "She's perfect," Adrian whispered. Vivian, exhausted and pale and more beautiful than he'd ever seen her, smiled from the bed. "What should we name her?" Adrian looked down at his daughter, this impossible tiny person who existed because he and Vivian had survived everything the world had thrown at them. And he thought about his brother, about Henry, who'd been brilliant and charming and too fragile for the weight of being Blackwell, who'd died alone in a rented room because addiction and pressure and expectations had crushed him. Henry had deserved better, deserved to be remembered as more than a cautionary tale. "Eleanor," Adrian said, "after my grandmother, but her middle name is Henrietta, after my brother." Vivian's expression softened. He would have liked that. I hope so. Adrian sat on the edge of the bed, still holding Eleanor while Vivian reached out and took his hand. "This is it, isn't it?" Vivian said quietly. "This is what we were fighting for, not the title or the power or the revenge. This." She gestured at the three of them, exhausted, messy, imperfect, real. "This is what matters." Adrian looked at his wife and his daughter and felt something shift in his chest. Not breaking, expanding, making room for a version of himself he'd never imagined. Not the Duke who fought for power, not the survivor who clawed his way back from exile, not the man who'd sacrificed everything for a title, just a father, a husband, a person trying to be better than he'd been. It was terrifying. It was perfect. "Yes," Adrian said. "This is it." 6 months later, they threw a party at Blackwell Manor. Not a political event or a strategic gathering, just a celebration. Friends, family, people who'd stood by them through the worst and deserved to be there for the better. Isabella came, bringing gifts for Eleanor and spending most of the evening telling embarrassing stories about Henry that made everyone laugh instead of grieve. Thomas coordinated everything with his usual efficiency, though Adrian caught him smiling more than he'd seen in years. Even the servants seemed lighter. Margaret Holt actually complimented Vivian's management of the household, which might have been the most shocking development of the entire year. Adrian stood on the terrace as the sun set, watching guests mingle in the garden, listening to music and laughter drift through the warm summer air. He felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to find Vivian standing beside him, holding Eleanor against her hip. "You're brooding," she said. "I'm reflecting. Same thing with you." Adrian smiled despite himself. "Maybe." Vivian shifted Eleanor to her other hip and leaned against the terrace railing. "What are you reflecting on? How different this is from our wedding." That night, I stood in a room full of people who wanted me to fail. Now I'm standing in a garden full of people who want us to succeed. That's what happens when you stop treating relationships like transactions. Adrian winced. "That obvious?" "Was I?" Painfully. Vivian glanced at him. "But you've gotten better. High praise. Don't let it go to your head." They stood in comfortable silence while Eleanor grabbed at Adrian's collar, trying to put it in her mouth. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if we hadn't fought back?" Vivian asked. "If we just accepted the verdict and stayed in Paris?" "Sometimes. We'd probably be happier, simpler lives, no political pressure, no constant battles. But Eleanor wouldn't exist. This version of us wouldn't exist. And I think I'd always wonder what we could have accomplished if we'd been brave enough to try." Vivian nodded slowly. "I think about my father sometimes, about how he died in prison while we were fighting to clear his name, how he never got to see us win." Her voice caught. Adrian put his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "He knew you loved him," Adrian said quietly. "And he knew you tried. That's more than most people get. I just wish he could have met her." Vivian looked down at Eleanor. "Wish he could have seen that something good came from all that suffering. He would have been proud of you, of the woman you became, the mother you are, the Duchess who's tougher than half the lords in Parliament." Vivian laughed, wiping her eyes. "You're terrible at comforting people. I'm aware. But I'm honest that you are." Eleanor squirmed, making her dissatisfaction with being held known. Vivian set her down carefully on a blanket they'd spread on the terrace, and she immediately started crawling toward a potted plant with clear destructive intent. Adrian scooped her up before she could reach it. "She's going to be a handful," he said. "She's your daughter." "Of course she is." "Our daughter." Vivian smiled. "Our daughter." They sat on the terrace together, watching the party continue below, taking turns keeping Eleanor from eating things she shouldn't, and Adrian felt something he'd spent most of his life thinking was weakness. Peace. Not the absence of conflict, the acceptance of it, the knowledge that battles would come and he'd fight them, but they didn't define him anymore. He'd been the duke who lost everything, the fugitive who fled to Paris, the fighter who clawed his way back, the reformer who changed Parliament. But sitting here with his wife and daughter, watching the sunset paint the sky gold and orange, he was just Adrian, and for the first time in his life, that was enough. The second wedding took place a year later. It was Vivian's idea. She'd mentioned it casually one morning over breakfast, saying their first wedding had been a transaction performed in front of people who despised them. She wanted to do it again, properly this time, as a choice instead of an obligation. Adrian had agreed immediately. They held it in the gardens of Blackwell Manor on a warm September afternoon. No political guests, no strategic invitations, just the people who mattered. Vivian wore a simple dress, cream-colored, elegant, nothing like the elaborate gown from their first wedding. Her hair was loose, flowers woven through it, and she looked more beautiful than Adrian had ever seen her. He stood at the makeshift altar, just an archway covered in roses that the gardeners had built, and watched her walk toward him. No terrified trembling this time. No eyes focused past his shoulder. She looked directly at him, smiling, completely present. When she reached him, she took his hands without hesitation. The officiant began the ceremony, but Adrian barely heard it. He was too focused on Vivian, on the calluses on her palms from the gardening she'd taken up, on the small scar above her eyebrow from where she'd hit her head during the fire at Vel's office, on the way her eyes reflected sunlight and certainty and a kind of fierce love that terrified and steadied him at the same time. The officiant asked for their vows. They'd written their own this time. Vivian went first. "Adrian," she said, her voice steady, "the first time we stood here, I promised to honor you out of obligation. This time, I'm promising to love you out of choice. You've shown me that strength isn't about never falling down. It's about getting back up. That courage isn't about never being afraid. It's about acting despite the fear. That family isn't about blood or titles or traditions. It's about the people you choose to fight for when the world tells you to give up. So I choose you, again. And I'll keep choosing you every day for the rest of my life." Adrian felt his throat tighten. Then it was his turn. He'd spent weeks trying to write something worthy of this moment. Something eloquent and profound and perfect. But standing here looking at Vivian, all those carefully crafted words disappeared. So he spoke from the heart instead. "Vivian, I've spent my entire life trying to control everything, trying to predict every outcome, manage every risk, protect myself from a world I saw as hostile. And then you walked into my life and broke every calculation I'd ever made. You refused to be controlled, refused to be predicted. You challenged me, fought beside me, saved me more times than I can count. And somewhere in all that chaos, you taught me something I'd never learned before. That the only thing worth having in this life is someone who sees you at your worst and chooses to stay anyway. Someone who makes you want to be better not because they demand it, but because they deserve it. You're that person for me. You're everything I didn't know I needed and everything I can't imagine living without. So I promise you this. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the choice you made when you decided I was worth saving." Vivian's eyes were bright with tears. The officiant pronounced them married. Adrian kissed his wife, not for show, not for politics, but because he wanted to. Because she was his and he was hers, and nothing else mattered. The small gathering erupted in applause. Eleanor, sitting in Isabella's lap, clapped her tiny hands together and shouted Dada with the kind of enthusiasm only a one-year-old could muster. And Adrian Blackwell, Duke of Blackwell, reformed Parliament, survivor of exile, and formerly one of the most feared political operators in England, laughed, because this chaotic, imperfect, beautiful life was better than any victory he'd ever imagined. That night, after the guests had left and Eleanor had been put to bed and the manor had settled into quiet, Adrian and Vivian stood on the balcony of their bedroom. The city sprawled below them, The same view he'd stared at a year ago when everything felt hollow and wrong. It looked different now. Or maybe he was different. Probably both. "Do you have any regrets?" Vivian asked. Adrian considered this question. He thought about Henry, dead in a rented room. About his father, who'd spent his last weeks trying to atone for years of coldness. About Lord Ashbourne, who died in prison never seeing his daughter's victory. About all the choices and sacrifices and losses that had brought them here. "I regret that people had to die for us to learn what mattered," Adrian said quietly. "I regret that I wasted so much time fighting for things that didn't make me happy. I regret that I was cruel when I could have been kind, strategic, when I could have been honest." He paused. "But I don't regret you. I don't regret Eleanor. I don't regret fighting back or reforming Parliament or any of it, because all of that led here. And here is exactly where I want to be." Vivian leaned her head against his shoulder. "The Duke who married me in that cold cathedral would never have said that. No, he wouldn't have. He was an idiot, a powerful idiot, still an idiot." Vivian laughed softly. "What changed?" "You," Adrian said simply. "You changed everything." They stood together in the darkness, listening to London breathe below them, and Adrian thought about the journey they'd taken. From strangers at an altar to partners in exile to parents building a life neither of them had planned. It hadn't been easy, hadn't been clean, hadn't been anything like the stories people told about love and power and redemption, but it had been real. And real was better than perfect. Real was messy and difficult and sometimes painful, but it was also honest and hard-won and worth every scar they'd collected along the way. Adrian pulled Vivian closer and pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Thank you," he whispered. "For what?" "For refusing to give up on me, even when I'd given up on myself." Vivian turned in his arms and looked up at him, her eyes reflecting moonlight and something deeper. "I'll never give up on you," she said. "That's the promise I'm making. Not just today, every day, for the rest of our lives. You're stuck with me." "Good," Adrian said, "because I'm not letting you go." They kissed there on the balcony, surrounded by the city they'd conquered and the life they'd built. And Adrian felt something he'd spent his entire life chasing finally click into place. Not power, not control, not victory. Home. This was home. Not the manor or the title or the duchy. Her. Them. The family they'd chosen and the future they were building one imperfect day at a time. And as the night settled around them and the stars emerged overhead, and somewhere inside Eleanor slept peacefully in her nursery, Adrian Blackwell finally understood what his father had been trying to tell him on his deathbed. Surviving wasn't enough. You had to know what you were surviving for. And Adrian knew now. He was surviving for mornings watching Eleanor destroy the gardens, for evenings debating policy with Vivian over dinner, for nights holding his wife and feeling her heartbeat against his chest, for the messy, chaotic, beautiful life they were building together. That was worth fighting for. That was worth everything. And when historians wrote about the Duke of Blackwell decades from now, they'd probably focus on the political reforms, the conspiracy he exposed, the corruption he helped dismantle. But Adrian didn't care about that legacy. His real legacy was sleeping in the nursery, was standing in his arms, was the choice he made every morning to be better than he'd been, kinder than he wanted to be, more human than he'd ever allowed himself. That was the legacy that mattered, and it was more than enough. 20 years later, Adrian stood in the same garden where he'd married Vivian twice, watching his daughter get married to a young man who looked absolutely terrified. Eleanor had inherited her mother's strength and her father's strategic mind, along with a stubborn streak that made both of them look reasonable by comparison. She'd refused 3 suitable matches before finding someone she actually loved, a scholar from Oxford with radical ideas about educational reform and absolutely no political ambition. Adrian approved. Vivian stood beside him, older now, silver threading through her dark hair, laugh lines around her eyes that told stories of 2 decades spent actually living instead of just surviving. She was more beautiful than ever. "Our daughter is getting married," Vivian said quietly. "I'm aware." "You're not going to cry, are you?" "Absolutely not." "Liar." Adrian smiled despite himself. Maybe a little. They watched Eleanor exchange vows, confident, certain, Nothing like the terrified girl Vivian had been at her first wedding. This was a woman who knew exactly what she wanted and had chosen it freely. That's what we gave her, Adrian thought. Not a title or a fortune or a political legacy. Freedom. The freedom to choose her own life, to make her own mistakes, to build something that mattered to her instead of living up to someone else's expectations. After the ceremony, Eleanor found them in the garden. She hugged Vivian first, then turned to Adrian. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For showing me what a real marriage looks like. Not the performative kind. The kind where you actually choose each other every day." Adrian felt his throat tighten. "You're going to make me emotional." "Good. You've spent my entire childhood being stoic. It's about time you showed some feelings." She hugged him tightly, and Adrian held his daughter, remembering the tiny infant who'd screamed in his arms 20 years ago. Time moved too fast, but it had been time well spent. When Eleanor pulled away, she looked at both of them with an expression Adrian recognized, the one that meant she was about to say something profound. "You know what I realized?" she said. "Growing up, I heard all these stories about how you two almost lost everything, how you had to fight for your marriage and your title and your lives, and I always thought that was the important part, the fighting." She paused. "But watching you these past 20 years, I realized that wasn't the story at all. The story was what you built after the fighting stopped, how you chose each other every single day, how you made peace more important than power, how you turned this house from a battlefield into a home." Adrian and Vivian exchanged glances. "That's the legacy I want," Eleanor continued. "Not the dramatic fight or the political victory, just the quiet choice to keep showing up for the person you love. That's what you taught me, and that's what I'm going to build with him." She glanced at her new husband, who was being interrogated by Isabella across the garden. Vivian wiped her eyes. "When did our daughter become so wise?" "She learned from the best," Adrian said quietly. Eleanor smiled, kissed them both on the cheek, and went to rescue her husband from Isabella's questioning. Adrian and Vivian stood alone in the garden, surrounded by guests and music and the life they'd built over 2 decades of choosing each other. "Not bad for a political marriage," Vivian said. "Not bad at all." "Do you think we did it right, raising her?" Adrian considered this question. "I think we did it honestly. We showed her our mistakes along with our victories. Let her see us fail and get back up. Taught her that strength isn't about never falling, it's about always getting back up. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I have." Vivian smiled and took his hand, and they stood together watching their daughter dance with her new husband, surrounded by the family they'd built and the legacy they'd created. Not a legacy of power or titles or political reform, though those things mattered, but a legacy of love, of choosing each other through the worst and the best, of building something real in a world that too often settled for performance. And as the sun set over Blackwell Manor and the music swelled and the garden filled with laughter, Adrian Blackwell finally understood the truth his father had tried to teach him. Power was temporary. Titles could be stripped. Fortunes could be lost. But love, real love, the kind built on choice and sacrifice and refusing to give up even when the world fell apart, that lasted. That was worth fighting for. That was worth everything. And he'd do it all again, every mistake and every victory, just to end up here, with her, with this life, with this home, exactly where he belonged.